It is the last blue hour of the evening on the wide flat country of the south, where two great rivers come down at the end of their long journey and go easing out toward the sea. The heat of the day has broken at last, the way it always breaks here toward night, all at once and with a kind of relief, and the light that was white and hard over the plain all afternoon has softened now into something low and golden and kind, lying long across the water and the reeds. There is no hill anywhere to be seen, no edge to the land at all, only the level marsh going on and on to a far horizon that has gone the colour of a ripe apricot, and the two rivers moving through it slow and brown and patient, so slow that in this light you can hardly tell they are moving at all, only that the reflected sky slides very gently along their backs and does not stay still. And a little way up from the water, where the wet ground firms into a low bank and a scatter of small round houses stands with their walls of packed river mud and their roofs of bundled reed, there is a single lamp burning in a doorway, one small dish of oil with a floating wick, one steady bead of amber light hung out against the coming dark, tended by someone you cannot see. And it is the only bright thing on all that great darkening plain tonight. It is not a warning, and it is not a summons. It is only a light left burning for anyone still out on the water in the last of the dusk, for the fisherman poling home through the tall reeds, saying to him without any words at all, "Here is the bank, here is the way in, there is no hurry, come in when you are ready, so come and stand here a moment on the warm dry mud at the edge of the marsh, with the reeds whispering faintly around you and the two great rivers breathing out toward the sea, and before we take a single step into this long night, before we go anywhere at all, let us set the day down. Whatever this day has been, however long it ran, or however much of you it asked for, you may lay it down now, right here at the edge of the water, the way a reed cutter at the end of the day slips the heavy sheaf from his shoulder and lets it fall in a soft heap on the bank, and straightens up at last with nothing left to carry. You do not have to hold it any longer. It will keep out here perfectly well until the morning, and the morning is a long, long way off, further off than you can imagine from where you are lying now. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all this while, a little higher than they needed to be, all day long. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, the entire weight of it, so that your neck has nothing left to do and nothing left to hold up. Let your hands lie open and easy, however they happen to fall. Take one slow breath in now, drawing it down deep and unhurried, all the way to the bottom. And then let it go even slower than it came, and notice as it goes how it is the letting go and not the drawing in. That is the restful part. Take another, and on the long, slow way out of it let your jaw come loose and your shoulders sink a little further down into the dark. And take one more, the softest of the three, and let everything in you that was still braced, still waiting, still half listening for something, simply loosen its hold and set itself gently down, the way the wet mud lets the last of a ripple slide back off it into the river. Good. That is all that was needed. And now, before we go any further into this night, one small thing, the same small thing we do together every night, because it is one of the kindest parts of these nights of ours. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whatever roof you are under, whatever hour it has drifted round to where you are, you might leave it below if you feel like it. A town, a country, a coast, a language, just a word or two, like a small mark pressed down into the soft wide clay of the world. And think of it this way tonight. We are standing at the edge of a great marsh, and all across that marsh, on every low mud bank and beside every still lagoon, there could be lamps like the one in the doorway behind us, small warm dishes of light kept burning through the night above the black water. And every time one of you leaves a mark below, it is as if one more of those little lamps is lit somewhere out across the dark reeds, another bead of amber set glowing against the night, so that by the time we have drifted all the way through this long night together, the whole marsh is scattered over with soft lights. Every single one of them a person lying quiet somewhere on the round and turning earth, listening, letting go, keeping the old rivers company across all the miles and all the years and all the thousands of years. So light your lamp out on the water if you like, and know that it is burning there among all the others, and let us go on. Now let me tell you the shape of this night, because it is a long one of the longest and slowest we have taken together, and I want you to feel before we start how little you have to do. On some nights we have chosen a single place and simply stayed there, and let one quiet day flow past us from dawn to midnight, and gone nowhere at all. But tonight we are going to do something larger, and in its own way even more restful, because it is so unhurried and so old. Tonight we are going to follow the whole long life of a people, the very first people ever to build cities and to write, from their earliest stirrings here in these warm river marshes all the way to their far quiet ending, thousands of years from where we stand now. And we are going to do it at the gentlest possible pace, the way you might walk the length of a very long dim gallery in a cool old house, pausing at each picture in its turn, never hurrying, letting each age hand us softly on to the next. We will begin here, in the reeds, at the very beginning of everything, in the deep early morning of the world, and we will move on, when the time is right, to a land of proud small cities each with its own god, and to a king who feared to die, and to the first empire ever gathered under one hand, and to a patient lawgiver and his tall stone of laws, and to war kings who built in stone and gathered a great library, and at the very last, a whole night and a whole world from now, to a shining blue gate and a tower and a sky full of carefully counted stars, and then to the long, soft sleep of it all beneath the grass. But every bit of that is far ahead, and there is not the slightest need to reach for any of it now. Tonight we begin at the beginning, and the beginning is here, in the marsh, in the blue hour, with the rivers breathing out toward the sea. And if you are asleep long before we ever leave these reeds, that is not a thing gone wrong, that is the whole and entire point, because the story will keep, and the rivers will go on flowing without you, patient and unhurried, exactly where you left them. So let me tell you where we are. This wide flat country lies between the two rivers, and long, long afterward people would give it a name that meant just that, the land between the rivers, though the people who first lived here never thought to call it anything so grand. To them it was only the world, the whole of it, all the world there was. The two rivers are very old and very great, and they come down from cold mountains far away in the north, mountains none of these marsh people would ever see, and they run down the long tilt of the land for hundreds and hundreds of miles, growing browner and slower and warmer as they come, until here, at the bottom of everything, they spread out wide and shallow and lose themselves at last in a country half water and half land, a great green wilderness of reeds, before they finally reach the sea. One of the rivers runs quick and fierce and unpredictable, and the other runs broad and slow and mild, and between the two of them they have made, over ages beyond counting, all the land there is down here, because every spring, when the far snows melt, the rivers rise and swell and brim over their low banks, and lay a thin new skin of dark mud across the whole flat plain, and then they fall again, and the mud dries, and the next spring they do it all over again. Layer on soft layer, flood after patient flood, they have built the ground itself out of nothing but carried silt, so that the very earth these people stand on is a gift the rivers made, a black and generous soil, the richest in all the world, deep and dark and soft, and out of it, once a person learned to cut a little channel and lead the water where he wished, almost anything at all would grow. And so people came down into this marshy country, a very long time ago, further back than any story reaches, and they found that it was hard, and that it was strange, and that it was, if you were patient, one of the kindest places on the earth. It was hard because it gave them almost nothing to build with. There was no stone down here, none, not so much as a pebble. There were no forests, no tall timber, hardly a proper tree at all. There was only the mud and the reeds and the water and the enormous sky. But out of just those few plain things, these people, whose own name for themselves has almost faded from the world, learned to make everything they needed. From the reeds, which grew taller than a man and thick as a wrist, and stood in vast whispering forests all across the marsh, they cut and bound great bundles. And from the bundles they made their boats, long slender curved boats that slipped through the shallow water without a sound, and their houses too, huge arched halls of bundled reed, ribbed and vaulted like the inside of some great creature, that have been built in exactly the same way, by exactly the same slow hands, for so many thousands of years that a man from the very beginning, and a man from almost the present day, could have walked into each other's houses and felt at home. And from the mud, the soft, dark, endless mud, they made all the rest. They scooped it up and shaped it, and let the fierce sun bake it hard, and so they made their bricks, one at a time, in little wooden moulds, thousands upon thousands of them, plain grey-brown blocks of dried river mud. And with those bricks they raised their walls and their houses, and in time their towers and their temples and their cities, so that everything they ever built, all of it, was made in the end of the ground itself, of the river's own patient gift, mud shaped by hand and dried in the sun and set one course upon another. At first they lived in little villages, small clusters of round mud houses on the higher, drier hummocks in the marsh, a few families together, keeping their sheep and their goats, poling out among the reeds to fish and to hunt the wildfowl that rose in great clattering clouds off the lagoons at dawn, cutting the reeds, tending small patches of barley on the flood-fed soil. And it was a good life, and a quiet one, and it might have stayed that way, small and scattered and content, for as long as the rivers ran. But the land in its generosity gave them a little more than they needed. The black soil, once they had learned to coax the river water out along their little channels to reach it, gave back grain in a great abundance, far more than a single family could eat, more than a whole village could eat, and that surplus, that quiet everyday miracle of more than enough, is where everything begins. For when there is more grain than the people who grew it can eat, then some of them need not spend their days bent over the barley at all. Some of them can become potters, and some weavers, and some can work only in reed or only in mud brick, and some can tend only the god, and so, slowly, over long lifetimes, out of the plain fact of a good harvest well shared, the people gathered themselves into something the world had never seen before. They gathered into cities. The very first of them, the oldest city in all the world, or so its own people always believed, stood right down at the marsh's edge, on a low rise beside a still blue lagoon, and its name was Eridu. To the people of this land, ever after, Eridu was the place where it had all begun. When they told the story of the very beginning of things, they said that Eridu was the first city that was ever founded, lowered down whole and ready from heaven onto the new-made land, and that here the very idea of a city, the idea of people living close gathered under a god with their houses and their trades all pressed together, was first given to humankind. And when you stand where Eridu stood, at the water's edge with the reeds all around and the huge flat sky above, and the lagoon lying still and shining, you can feel why they thought so, why they made this quiet spot the hinge of all their oldest stories. For here they raised, on that low rise, a small house for their god, only a little shrine of mud brick to begin with, no bigger than a room, set on a low platform to lift it up out of the wet, and then, when that first little shrine grew old and crumbled, as mud brick always crumbles in the end, they did not clear it away. They levelled its worn walls, and packed the ruin firm, and built a new and slightly larger shrine on the platform its own body had become. And when that one aged, they did the same again and again and again, patiently. Over hundreds and then thousands of years, each new house of the god rising on the packed remains of all the houses that had gone before, so that the holy place climbed slowly. Of its own accumulating past, higher and higher above the flat plain, lifted up toward heaven on the long layered memory of itself. This is how the great towers of this land were born, not from any grand design, but from that one gentle, faithful refusal to let the old thing simply vanish, that quiet building of the new upon the carefully kept old, over ages beyond the reach of any single life. And as Eridu was the oldest, so, a little way upriver and a little later, there rose the greatest of all these early cities, and its name was Uruk. If Eridu was the still lagoon at the very edge of things, Uruk was the place where the whole idea of a city first opened out into its full and astonishing flower. It grew, and it grew, until it was larger than any place people had ever built or gathered in before, a true city at last, tens of thousands of people living together within a single ring of wall, more people in one place than had ever in the history of the world stood within sight of one another. At its heart rose not one temple mound now, but two great platformed sanctuaries lifted high above the roofs, one of them for the sky god of the city, and one, the most beloved of all, for the bright and terrible goddess of the evening star, the lady of love and of war, who hung her single clear lamp low in the west just after sunset, the very first light to come out over the marsh each night, the same soft planet you might see yourself, low in the dusk, on some clear evening still. Around those high temples spread the wide brown city, its close-packed mud houses and its narrow shaded lanes and its noisy quays where the reed boats and the little sailing craft came and went along the river and the canals, and around the whole of it ran the wall, the great long wall of Uruk, mile upon mile of it, baked brick set on baked brick, so broad along the top, they said, that you might walk it round the entire city, and so well and truly made that the memory of it lasted longer than the wall itself, longer than the city, longer than the whole people, all the way down, in fact, to us, tonight. Because it was here, in Uruk, in this first and greatest of cities, at just about this moment in the long early morning of the world, that the quiet miracle happened, the one that matters most of all the many things that happened here, the one because of which we are able to sit here at all tonight and speak of these people so long after they are gone. Here human beings learned to write. And they did not learn it, you should know, out of any wish to make poems, or to keep their thoughts, or to send their love across the miles, or for any of the reasons we might first imagine. They learned it, of all the plain and homely reasons in the world, in order to keep count. For in a city as great as Uruk, with its temple that gathered in the offerings of thousands, that took in the barley and the sheep and the wool and the jars of oil from all the wide fields and folds around, and stored them, and shared them out again. Somebody had to remember how much. Somebody had to keep the reckoning of all those goods flowing in and out, and no single memory, however faithful, could hold it all. And so, long before the writing, they had used little tokens, small shapes of clay, a small cone perhaps for a measure of grain, a little sphere for a larger measure, a small clay disc for a sheep, and they would gather up a handful of these tokens to stand for a handful of real goods, and keep them and count them. It was a good idea, and it worked, and it was, though no one could have known it, the seed of the whole enormous thing to come. Then, at some point that no one recorded and no one could ever record, because the very recording of things had not yet been born, someone in one of those temple storerooms had a further small thought, so small it must have seemed nothing at all. Instead of keeping the little clay tokens loose, where they might be lost or miscounted, why not press each one into the surface of a soft clay tablet, and let the marks stand for the tokens the way the tokens stood for the goods? And then, once the marks were there on the clay, pressed clear and clean, why keep the tokens at all? Why not simply make the marks? And so a reed was cut, and its end was trimmed to a clean wedge, and it was pressed into the wet flat clay, again and again, this way and that, each little press leaving a small sharp wedge-shaped stroke, narrow at one end and wide at the other, like the print of a bird's foot in soft mud, and out of clusters of those little wedges, grouped and gathered just so, they built up their signs. First a sign that meant simply barley, and one that meant sheep, and one that meant a jar of oil, and numbers to set beside them, so many, so many, so many. And with that, with a trimmed reed and a palmful of river mud and the humble wish to keep an honest account of the grain, the very first writing in all the world came quietly into being, here in the storerooms of Uruk, on the black soil the rivers had made. There is a king whose name belongs to this city, and I want only to set it down softly here at the very beginning, the way you might lay one small bright thing on a shelf to come back to later, for we will meet him again, more than once, on later nights of this long story, and each time he will mean a little more. His name was Gilgamesh, and whether there truly was such a man walking the top of that great wall in the cool of the evening, no one can any longer say for certain. He stands right on the misted line between the kings that were and the kings that were only ever dreamed. But his people believed in him utterly, and they told in time that it was Gilgamesh who raised the mighty wall of Uruk, mile upon mile of good baked brick, and that when at the very end of all his wandering and all his striving, he came home worn and quiet to his own city, the one thing he had left to be proud of, the one thing that would truly outlast him, was that wall. Go up onto it, the oldest story in the world would one day say of him, walk its length, look at the fine brickwork of it, see how well it was made. This is what a life leaves behind. But all of that is far ahead of us, on nights still to come. For now he is only a name, spoken once, softly and set aside. Only the half-legendary king who is said to have built the walls, out there in the dark of the sleeping city, while the river runs by. And so let us close this first small chapter of the night where it is right to close it, in one of those storerooms, late, with everyone else long asleep. A single lamp is burning, one small dish of oil with its floating wick, its little flame standing very still in the windless dark, and by its low amber light one person is bent over a fresh flat tablet of river clay, still damp and cool and grey, a trimmed reed in hand. And into the soft clay he presses his careful rows of wedges. So many measures of barley, so many sheep, so many jars of oil, gathered in on such a day for the house of the god. No poem, no prayer, no grand thing at all, only the plain and honest count of the harvest, kept true. And when he has finished, he sets the little tablet aside on a shelf to dry, and the marks in it begin, very slowly in the warm night air, to harden and to keep, and he leans back, and he thinks nothing much of it, and he puts out the lamp, and he goes to his bed. He does not know, he cannot possibly know, that what has just dried on that shelf in the dark is the oldest handwriting there has ever been. The first time in all the long life of the world that a human thought was pressed down into a lasting thing and made to stay. The very first words, waiting there quietly in the sleeping city for the morning, and for all the mornings, and for us. And the rivers run on past the wall in the dark, slow and brown and patient, easing forever toward the sea, and there is nothing at all for you to do now but rest, and let the good clay keep it, and drift on with the water into the deep of the night. And so the little tablet dries by its lamp, and the years go by, more years than any one person could ever hold in mind, and while they pass let us do nothing at all but drift forward through them, the way a reed boat drifts down the slow brown river without anyone needing to touch the pole. For that first scratched mark on the damp clay was only the beginning of the beginning, one seed pressed into the black mud of the south, and out of that seed and 1,000 quiet years there grew, all along these two great rivers, not one city now, but many, a whole wide land of them, sprung up out of the reeds and the flooded fields between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the people who lived there came at last to have a name for the land itself. They called it Sumer, the low green country at the foot of the world, where the rivers slowed and spread and let their good dark silt fall, and where, in the mature and flourishing morning of the world, cities stood along the water like beads strung out upon a cord. So let us walk down into that land now, softly, in the last of an evening 4,500 years old, and see what 1,000 years of patience had made of the reeds. For here is the thing to carry gently into sleep about this land of Sumer. It was not one kingdom, under one crown, ruled from one high seat. It was many. It was a scattering of proud and separate cities, each one standing on its own low rise above the floodplain, each one with its own ring of fields and its own web of canals, each one keeping its own house and minding its own affairs, the way a row of farmsteads down a single long valley will each keep its own hearth and its own gate, and yet all drink from the same slow river. There was down near the head of the gulf, where the great river met the sea, rich with the trade that came in by water. There was Uruk still, the old first city we knew in the beginning, grown grey and venerable now, its brick walls softened by the years. There was Lagash out among its canals, forever counting and recounting its boundaries with its neighbours over who might draw off which stream of water into which field. For water was the one true wealth here, and no one ever had quite enough of it. There was Kish up on the higher ground to the north, whose kings liked to call themselves the eldest and the first. And there, in the very middle of them all, wholly above all the rest, there was Nippur, which no king ruled, and which every king wished to be seen to honour, because Nippur belonged to Enlil, the chief of all the gods, the lord of the wind and the air, and to hold Nippur, or even to be blessed by its priests, was to hold a kind of blessing over the whole of the land. So picture them now, if you like, as you lie there in the dark, a handful of low brown cities scattered across a wide flat green country, under an enormous evening sky, each one a little island of lamplight and smoke and murmuring voices, each one tending its own god and its own gardens, and its own long silver threads of water, all of them separate, and all of them the same, all of them Suma, breathing quietly together in the dusk. And each of these cities, you must understand, belonged to a god before it ever belonged to a king, and this is perhaps the gentlest way to understand the whole shape of a Sumerian city, so let us stand a while inside one and feel how it was made. At the heart of every city, up on the highest ground, in the safest and most honoured place, there stood not a palace, but a temple, the house of the city's own god, and the whole city was gathered around that house the way a family gathers round the oldest hearth. The god of was Nana, the moon, the pale slow lamp of the night sky, and was his city, and his household, and his farm, and the people thought of themselves, quite simply, as his people, the tenants and the servants and the children of the moon. And because the god owned the city, the god, in a manner of speaking, owned the land, and the temple that was his house on earth became the great storehouse, and the great workshop, and the great counting place of the whole city, the still centre around which everything turned. This is what people mean when they speak of the temple economy, and there is nothing cold in it, not at this hour. It is only a picture of a whole town organised around a single generous idea, that the god's house gathered in the harvest and kept it safe and gave it back out again. Down to the temple, at harvest, came the barley in from the fields, and the wool in from the flocks, and the fish up from the river, and the dates down from the palms, all of it flowing in and laid up in the great cool storerooms. And out from the temple, all through the year, it flowed again, rations of grain and oil and wool, measured out to the weavers and the potters and the brewers and the field hands, who did the god's work and ate at the god's table. And moving quietly through it all, keeping the endless account of what came in and what went out, were the scribes with their reeds and their tablets, so that the whole of that patient giving and gathering was written down, sheep by sheep and jar by jar, in the wedge marks we watched being born a chapter ago. The god's house was the beating heart of the city, and the whole city lived by its slow and steady pulse, in and out, and in again, like breathing, like the tide, like the river easing down to the sea. And now let us lift our eyes, in the dusk, to the greatest thing that any of these cities built, for it is worth resting on a long, quiet while, and no city built it grander than Come up through the streets of toward the temple, and there ahead of you, rising up out of the flat brown town against the enormous evening sky, is a mountain that men have made. The Sumerians had no true mountains anywhere in their whole flat country. Not a single hill worth the name in all that spread of silt and reed and water, and so, longing to lift the house of their god up nearer to heaven, they built themselves a mountain out of the only thing they had, which was mud. They built the ziggurat. Picture it now, in the last of the light, a vast rectangular platform of solid brick, longer than you can easily throw a stone, and rising sheer from the plain to a great flat height, and then set back upon that, a second platform, smaller, and then a third set back upon that, smaller still, so that the whole rose in broad receding tiers, a stepped stone stair for a giant, a made hill climbing up and up toward the sky in stages, tier upon tier, until at the very top, small and far up against the first stars, stood the little shrine, the god's own high chamber, the topmost room of the tallest thing for 100 miles in any direction. Millions upon millions of bricks went into it, each one shaped by hand in a wooden mould and dried in the sun, laid up course upon course with reed matting and river tar between them to bind the great mass together and let the damp seep out, and up the front of it 3 long straight stairways climbed to meet at the first terrace, wide processional stairs made for slow and solemn feet. And when the priests went up at evening, up the long stairs and up again and up once more to the little high shrine, they were climbing, in their own minds, a holy mountain, going up out of the world of men toward the doorway of heaven, carrying the city's prayers up into the cooling air. Think of standing at the foot of it in the dusk, and tipping your head slowly back to follow it up, tier by tier, into the darkening sky. The last daylight still warm on its highest bricks, long after the streets below had gone into shadow, the pale moon of Nana just showing above its topmost shrine. It was the largest and the calmest thing in all the land, this made mountain of patient mud, and it stood over the sleeping city like a great low hill stands over a valley, keeping the night, and much of it stands there yet, worn and enormous and quiet, 4,000 years on, still climbing its slow tiers toward a sky it will never quite reach. And content, it seems, to climb them forever. And down at the foot of that great-made mountain, in a little cluster of rooms among the temple buildings, there was a school, and it is one of the tenderest places in all this old world to look into for a while before we sleep. So let us push open its door very softly and step inside. The Sumerians called it the Aduba, which means, in their old tongue, the tablet house, and it was the place where the scribes were made, for someone had to learn all those thousands of little wedge marks, and they were not easy, and they were not learned in a day. Picture the tablet house in the warm middle of the morning, a small courtyard open to the sky, and rows of young boys, mostly, sitting cross-legged on the beaten earth. Each one with a lump of soft river clay worked round in his hand until it was smooth and damp and ready, and a cut reed for a stylus, its end trimmed to a neat wedge, and at the front the schoolmaster, whom they called, rather grandly, the father of the tablet house, and his older helpers, the big brothers, who kept the little ones in order. And the whole work of the place, hour upon hour, day upon day, was this. The master would press a sign into a fresh tablet, and the boy would copy it, and copy it, and copy it again, down his own tablet in careful columns, the same sign, the reed pressed in at just the right angle to leave that small clean wedge, over and over, until his hand knew it without his mind. And then the next sign. And the next, the long lists of them, the names of all the fish, the names of all the birds, the names of all the trees and the vessels and the gods and the towns, and the endless sums, so many measures of barley owed at so much a day, worked patiently down the wet grey clay. It was learning by rote, learning by the hand as much as the head, learning the way water learns a channel, by going the same way 1,000 times until the way is worn smooth, and when a tablet was full it was smoothed over with a wet thumb and used again. And when a boy did well he was praised, and when he did ill, we know, for they wrote of it themselves, ruefully long after he was caned, for talking, or for rising without leave, or for making his signs badly. And he went home sore, and came back the next day, and pressed the same wedges once more into the same soft clay. And here is the thing to carry with you, drifting now towards sleep, those very boys, those small cross-legged copyists with clay under their nails and a smarting hand, bent over their lists in the shadow of the ziggurat 4,000 years ago, are the reason we can hear this land speak at all tonight. For they copied out, among their exercises, the old stories and the old hymns and the old proverbs, again and again, generation after generation of them, small hand after small hand, and so they carried the words down to us across the enormous dark, without ever meaning to, simply by learning their letters. Let them copy on, softly, in the warm morning of the world, and let us step back out into the street. For out beyond the temple and the school there was the city itself, the ordinary living city, and it was full of ordinary people going ordinarily about their day, and there is no better lullaby in all the world than the small, unhurried sounds of people at their work. So let us just stand a moment in a street of and let those sounds come and go. Here in an open-fronted workshop sits the potter at his wheel, and this is a thing worth watching until your eyes grow heavy, for it is the oldest of soothing sights. He has his lump of the good river clay centred on the wheel, and he sets the wheel turning with a push of his foot, and then he simply holds his wet hands to the spinning clay, steady and unhurried. And the clay rises up between them, as if by its own quiet will, up into the smooth swelling shape of a jar, walls thinning, mouth opening, the whole thing turning and turning under his calm palms, and when it is done he stops the wheel with the flat of his foot, and lifts the soft new pot away to dry in the sun with all its brothers along the wall, and reaches for the next lump, and begins again. And here, out past the last houses where the fields begin, goes the shepherd, taking his flock out to the stubble in the cool of the evening, and the sheep move ahead of him in a slow grey woolly tide, with their small bells knocking softly, and he walks behind them leaning on his staff, in no hurry at all, for the sheep set the pace, and the sheep are never in a hurry. And the dust hangs gold behind them in the low light. And here, down at the river's edge, at the bottom of the town, the fisherman is poling his reed boat home along the still brown water in the dusk. His boat is made all of reeds, great bundles of the marsh reed lashed tight together and turned up at either end, light as a leaf on the water. And he stands in the stern of it, and sets his long pole down against the mud of the river bottom and leans, and the boat slides forward with a small ripple and a whisper, and he lifts the pole and sets it and leans again, and so he goes, unhurried, homeward, with his few silver fish in the bottom of the boat and the whole red evening sky lying broken and shining on the water all around him, the potter and the shepherd and the fisherman in his reed boat and the weaver and the brewer with the good yeasty smell coming out of his door, and the mothers calling the children in from the flat roofs where the families slept in the hot months. All of them going home now as the light goes, all of them setting down the day's work in the dusk, all of them, 4,500 years ago, doing exactly the thing that you are doing tonight, which is coming quietly to the end of a day and letting it go. And it was here, among these very people, in these very cities, under the shadow of that same made mountain of brick, that there grew up the oldest story in all the world, the first great story that human beings ever wrote down and kept, and it is right that we should come to it now, at the deep centre of the night, and tell it very gently, for of all the old tales there ever were, this one, at its heart, is about exactly the thing we come here to practice every night, the setting down of the striving, the laying down of the day. It is the story of Gilgamesh. You will remember him from the very beginning of all this, a chapter and an age ago, the half-legendary king of old Uruk, who is said to have raised its mighty walls, and now, long after his own time, the singers and the scribes of Sumer had woven the memory of him into a great and wandering tale, and copied it out, boy after boy, in the tablet houses, so that it comes down to us still. And the tale they told was this. Gilgamesh was a king with everything a man could want, strong beyond all other men, tall and beautiful and proud, the lord of a great city with high walls. And yet he was restless, and hard on his people, forever driving them and himself towards some greater deed, some higher wall, some further glory, never content, never still. And the gods, to gentle him, sent him a friend, a wild man out of the hills named Enkidu, who was his match in strength, and the two of them, after a great and equal wrestling that left them laughing, became the dearest of companions, closer than brothers, and together they went out and did great deeds and had great adventures, the two of them side by side, in the full golden strength of their youth, and for a while Gilgamesh was happy, and the striving in him slept. But nothing in this world stays as it is, not even the friendship of heroes. And here the story turns, and here we must tell it most softly of all. For Enkidu, the beloved friend, fell ill, and after many days he died, quietly, in the end, in his bed, with Gilgamesh beside him, and the great king, who had never in his life been stopped by anything, was stopped at last, utterly, by this. He would not believe it. He sat by his friend, and would not let him be taken away, they say, until he saw that his friend was truly gone from him, truly and forever, and something in the mighty king broke, and he wept as he had never wept, and grief came down over him like a great darkness. But it was not only grief for his friend, though that was bitter enough, it was something more, something that rose up out of the grief and would not let him rest, and it was this: if Enkidu, so strong, so dear, so full of life, could die, then he, Gilgamesh, must one day die as well. For the first time the king truly saw his own ending, standing far off but certain at the end of his own road, and he was afraid, deeply and simply afraid, the way we are all of us afraid in the small hours sometimes, and he could not bear it. And so, half mad with sorrow and with fear, he did the thing the story is really about. He set out, alone, to run away from death, to find some way, any way, to live and never die. He put off his kingship and his fine robes, and dressed himself in the skins of animals, and he left his good city behind him, and he went out into the wilderness to search, wandering over the mountains and the wide empty lands, worn and ragged and wild-eyed, looking for the one thing no one had ever found. For he had heard that there was, somewhere at the very edge of the world, one man, only one, who had escaped death. An old man named Utnapishtim, who lived far away beyond the rim of everything with his wife, and who alone of all people had been granted life without end, and Gilgamesh made up his mind to find him, and to learn his secret. And so the story becomes a long, strange, dreamlike journey, exactly the kind of journey to follow as you are sinking down towards sleep, for it is all crossings and thresholds and passing throughs. He came to a great mountain where the sun goes down, guarded by fearful creatures who let him pass when they saw his grief, and he went into the mountain, into a long dark tunnel under the world, and ran through the pitch blackness for hour after hour, with the dark pressing close on every side, until at last he came out into a wonderful garden by the sea, where the fruit on the trees was made of jewels. And beyond that garden lay a wide and bitter water, the waters of death, that no one could cross, and on its far shore lay the old man he sought, and there was a ferryman there, and Gilgamesh, after much trouble, persuaded the ferryman to carry him over, and they cut long poles, and pushed out onto that still and dangerous sea, and crossed it slowly, carefully, without ever once letting the deadly water touch their hands, until the reed boat grounded at last on the farther shore, at the very end of the world, where the old immortal man stood waiting. And what did the old man tell him when Gilgamesh at last stood before him, ragged and exhausted and desperate, and begged to be told the secret of undying life? He told him a story. He told him quietly the oldest memory the land of the rivers kept, that long ago the gods had sent a great flood over all the earth, a rising of the waters to cover the whole world, and that he, Utnapishtim, had been warned in time, and had built a great boat, and had taken into it his family and the seed of every living thing, and had shut the door, and the rains had come, and the rivers had risen, and the flood had covered everything, all the cities and the fields and the reed huts and the works of men, until there was nothing anywhere but the wide grey water and the little boat riding upon it, under a weeping sky. Let the flood be soft tonight. Do not picture the drowning, only the endless quiet water and the small boat rocking upon it, up and down, patient and safe, while the rain fell. For the boat came at last to rest upon the top of a mountain as the waters sank, and the old man sent out a dove, and then a swallow, and then a raven, to look for dry land. And when the raven did not come back, he knew the earth was rising up again out of the flood, and he opened the door and stepped out into a world washed clean and new. And for surviving, the gods had given him and his wife the gift of life without end, and set them here, far away at the edge of things, to live quietly forever. But the old man told Gilgamesh gently that was a thing that happened once long ago and would never happen so again. There was no such gift to be won a second time, no door for Gilgamesh to walk through into endless life. Death was woven into the world for men, he said, the way sleep is woven into the day, and it was no more to be escaped than sleep is, and no more in the end to be feared. There was one last hope held out, and then softly taken away, and the taking away is the whole tenderness of the tale. The old man told him of a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea, a thorny plant that could make an old man young again. And Gilgamesh, still striving, still unwilling to give up, tied heavy stones to his feet, and sank down through the water, and plucked it, and rose again with it in his hand, overjoyed, meaning to carry it home to his city. But on the long road back, weary, he stopped to bathe in a cool pool, and laid the plant down on the bank, and while he bathed a serpent came silently out of the water, and ate it, and slid away, shedding its old skin as it went, leaving Gilgamesh alone on the bank with empty hands. And so he had lost it, the last thing, the final hope, and there was nothing left to reach for, and nowhere further to go, and the great striving that had driven him out over the whole world at last, on that quiet river bank, simply ran out and stopped. And he sat down, they say, and wept once more, and then he rose, and turned, and went home. And here is the ending of the oldest story in the world, and it is the softest and the wisest ending there could be, and it is the reason we have told the whole long tale tonight. Gilgamesh came home to Uruk, his own city, worn and quiet and empty-handed, and as he came near he saw before him the great walls of the city that he himself had built, the mighty brick walls rising up in the evening light, and he stopped and looked at them, and something in him at last grew still. For he understood, standing there, that he would not live forever, that no man would, and that this was not, after all, a horror to run from to the ends of the earth, but simply the way of things, gentle and sure, and he understood too that he had, all along, without ever seeing it, the only kind of lasting a man is given, which was this good city, these strong walls, the ordinary living place he had made that would stand and shelter people long after he himself lay down. And it was enough. It was more than enough. And the restlessness that had driven him all his life, out past the mountains and across the waters of death to the very edge of the world and back, that great striving and grasping and reaching for more, he set it down there at his own gate. At last, like a heavy pack lifted off tired shoulders and let fall, and he went in through the walls of his own city, a quieter and a kinder king. Content, at the end, to have built a good wall and to lay the striving down. And is that not, in the end, the very thing we come here to do, you and I, every single night? To set down the reaching and the striving of the day. To stop trying to seize the plant that always slips away. To look at the ordinary good things we already have and find that they are enough, and to lie down quietly at last within our own good walls? The oldest story that human beings ever thought to write, pressed wedge by wedge into the wet clay by the boys in the tablet house under the shadow of the ziggurat, turns out to be a bedtime story after all, the first and eldest of all bedtime stories, and its whole long wandering leads only home, only back to the walls and the pillow and the letting go. So let Gilgamesh sleep now, the striving all set down, safe within the walls of Uruk, and let the potter and the shepherd and the fisherman sleep, and the boys in the tablet house with clay still on their fingers, and the whole low green land of Sumer lie quiet under its enormous sky, city by scattered city, each one gathered close around its own god's house, each one keeping its own small lamp against the dark. The ziggurat climbs its slow tiers toward the first stars and asks nothing. The rivers ease down toward the sea. And far off to the north, though there is not the slightest need to reach for it yet, a child is one day to be drawn from a basket out of the river, and a new and greater thing is coming that will gather all these proud separate cities into one. But that is a long way off, a whole turn of the night away, and it will keep, as everything keeps here, patient in the dark. For now there is only Sumer in the dusk, and the striving laid down, and the good walls standing, and you, resting easy within your own, with all the long night still before you. Let it all go soft now, and breathe, and drift, the way the reed boat drifts down the darkening river, homeward, in no hurry at all. And so Gilgamesh laid his long striving down, and came home to his good walls, and the oldest story in the world settled at last into rest, the way you are settling now. But the cities he left behind him did not rest, or not for long, and that is where this next part of our night begins. So let us drift on a little further down the river of years, gently, in no hurry at all, and see what became of that green and crowded land. For the Sumer we have been wandering through, that patchwork of proud little city-states along the slow brown rivers, each one tending its own god and its own canals, each one ringed with its own mud walls and ruled by its own lord, was a land of many small sons and no single one. And small sons, when there are a great many of them close together, do tend to quarrel. Looked to its river mouth and its trade, and Lagash looked to its fields, and Uruk remembered old Gilgamesh, and Kish sat proud in the north, and holy Nippur kept the great god Enlil between them all, and up and down the plain the cities pushed against one another over water and boundary stone, and the right to call themselves first, sending out their spearmen along the canal banks in the heat, and drawing them home again, and pushing out once more, season upon season, the way children in one crowded bed will tug the same blanket back and forth all night and never quite settle. None of it need trouble you now. It is all more than 4,000 years gone, and the boundary stones they fought over are long since sunk in the mud. And the water they quarrelled over ran to the sea and was drawn up into the clouds and has rained down 1,000 times since on gentler fields. But hold the picture of it lightly as we go on. The many small proud cities, each sure it was the centre of the world, none of them yet dreaming that one day a single hand might gather them all up together like a fistful of scattered barley, and hold them, and make of them one thing. For that is what was coming, though no one on all that quarrelling plain could have foreseen it, and it came, as the greatest changes so often do in this long story, from the humblest possible beginning, from a baby in a basket on the water. And here is the tale they told of it, afterward, when he had become too large for plain remembering and had passed, the way Gilgamesh passed, halfway into legend, and we will tell it softly tonight, as a cradle tale, because it is one, quite literally, a tale that begins with a cradle set afloat. They said that there was a woman, a priestess of some quiet temple in the north, who bore a son she was not permitted to keep, and that rather than let him come to harm she did for him the tenderest thing she could think of. She took a little basket, a basket of the river reeds that grew everywhere along those banks, the same reeds the marsh people built their whole world of, and she wove it tight, and she sealed it against the water with dark river pitch, smearing the black bitumen over the woven reeds with her own hands until it would float and keep its passenger dry, and into that little sealed ark she laid her baby, and she set the lid upon it, and she carried it down through the reeds in the grey of the early morning, and set it gently on the breast of the great river, the Euphrates, and let it go. Think how quiet that must have been, the wide pale water just beginning to catch the first light, the mist lying low, the small dark basket turning slowly out from the bank and finding the current and beginning, without a sound, to drift, and the child inside it asleep, rocked by the oldest cradle there is, the moving water, carried away downstream toward whatever the day would bring, while the reeds whispered and closed again behind him. There is no fear in it. He is asleep, and the river is carrying him, and the river knows the way. And the river carried him down to where a man was working, a gardener, a drawer of water, one of the countless patient men whose whole task in that land was to lift the river up out of its bed and pour it onto the thirsty fields, dipping and lifting, all the long day, so that the barley might grow. And this gardener, bending to his work at the water's edge, saw the little basket come turning down out of the mist and catch against the bank, and he reached out and drew it in, and lifted the lid and found the sleeping child, and having no son of his own or wanting one, he took the baby up out of the reeds and carried it home and raised it as his own, and taught it the only trade he knew, the humble green trade of the garden, the tending of the date palms and the carrying of the water. And so the child who had been set adrift grew up a gardener's boy, with his hands in the soil and the river water, knowing nothing of priestesses or thrones, and by every reasonable reckoning he should have lived and died exactly so, one more brown patient man among the 10,000 along the banks, and been forgotten as they all are forgotten. His name, the name we know him by now, was Sargon, and he would become the first emperor in the history of the world. We do not truly know how he climbed, and the climbing is not the restful part, so let us pass over it lightly. The story says he rose out of the garden into the service of the king of Kish, that proud northern city, and became the king's cupbearer, the man who stood close by the throne and poured the wine, a place of trust near the very heart of power, and that from there, by some turn we can no longer follow, he took the kingship of Kish for himself, and then did the thing no one before him had ever managed to do. He did not stop at ruling one city. He went out from Kish with his soldiers, and he came down the plain against the other cities, one after another, against proud Uruk and against Ur and against Lagash and all the rest, and one after another he mastered them. And where the old way had always been for a conqueror to sack a rival city and burn it and go home the richer, Sargon did something new and stranger and far more lasting. He kept them. He gathered them in and held them, all of them, all the quarrelling little sons of Sumer bound now under his one hand, and he set his own trusted men to govern them in his name, and he tore down their boundary walls so that they could no longer stand apart from one another, and he made of the whole long plain, for the first time ever, a single realm. And he built himself a new city to rule it from, a fresh capital called Akkad, or Agadi, somewhere in the middle of the land, and so complete has the forgetting been since then, so many the centuries of drifting mud, that this city, the seat of the world's first empire, the Rome of its age, is the one great city of all Mesopotamia whose place upon the earth we have wholly lost, and cannot find, and dig for in vain to this day. It lies out there still, somewhere under the flat brown plain, a low grassy mound among other mounds with no name, sleeping so deeply that not even its own dust remembers where it is. And with that new city came a new tongue laid gently over the old land, and this too is worth resting a moment upon, softly, because it is one of the quiet ways an empire changes a world. The people of the old cities, Ur and Uruk and the rest, had spoken Sumerian, that ancient language of the marsh and the first writing, a tongue unlike any other on the earth then or now, with no cousins and no kin. But Sargon and his people of Akkad spoke something different, a language called Akkadian, of the great Semitic family, sister to the tongues that would one day be spoken all across those lands, and under his rule and his sons, the Akkadian tongue spread out across the plain and became the speech of the palace and the road and the market. The language a merchant used and a soldier used and a governor used to send his orders down the long canals. The old Sumerian did not die of it. Not for a long while it drew back, the way the palace speech of a fallen court draws back, into the temples and the schools, becoming a holy and a learned tongue, the Latin of that world, kept alive by the scribes for the singing of the old hymns and the copying of the old tales long after the last child had ceased to babble it in the street. But the everyday air of the land, from Sargon's time on, carried more and more the sound of Akkadian, and the little wedge marks pressed in the clay, which had been invented to write the one language, learned patiently to write the other, and so the writing outlived the tongue it was born for, and bent itself to a new one, the way a good tool outlives the first hand that held it. All of which is only to say that the world grew wider and more joined together under this gardener's foundling than it had ever been before. One rule and one road and one working tongue stretched from the salt marshes at the river mouth up to the far hills, and a man might carry a message now, or a jar of oil, or a song, from one end of it to the other, and be understood the whole way. And now let me bring you the loveliest thing in all of Sargon's long reach, the thing to carry down into sleep tonight, because it is not a battle or a boundary or a fallen wall, but a voice, a single human voice speaking to us out of the very deepest dark of time. And it is a woman's voice, and it is the first voice in the whole history of the world that we can call by its own name. Sargon had a daughter, and he gave her the highest and holiest office a woman could hold in that land. He made her the high priestess of the moon god at the En, the great lady of the temple of Nana, whose stepped tower we have already climbed together, the moon god who sailed his silver boat across the night sky over the sleeping plain. Her name was Enheduanna, and she did not only tend the temple and keep the rites and watch the moon rise over the ziggurat, though she did all of that, she wrote. She took up the reed stylus, or set scribes to follow her voice, and she made poems, hymns long and passionate, and carefully shaped songs to the gods, and above all to a goddess she loved, the goddess Inanna, the bright and terrible lady of love and of war, whom you may already know by the name of a star, for Inanna was the planet we call Venus, the great white morning star that hangs low and steady in the paling east just before the sun comes up, and the same star come round again, that burns first in the west at dusk. And Enheduanna sang to her. She sang of her power and her glory, she sang of the moon god her father god riding the night. She sang, in one famous poem, of her own trouble, of a time she was driven out from her temple by some rebellion in the land, and cried out to her goddess to restore her. And she did a thing in those poems that no one, so far as we know, had ever done before in all the tens of thousands of years that people had been speaking and singing. She signed her name. She said in effect, out of the clay, across 4,300 years, straight to you lying there in the dark tonight, I am Enheduanna, and these words are mine, and I made them. Sit a moment with how astonishing that is, gently, the way you would hold a warm cup in both hands. Before her, all the writing there had ever been was the writing of no one in particular, the count of the sheep and the oil, the list, the receipt, the tally, words that belonged to the palace or the temple, and not to any single beating heart. And behind her stretch 100,000 years of song and story that were sung and told and passed from mouth to mouth and are gone, every one, because no one could catch them, sung by people whose names blew away like smoke the moment they had finished singing. And then, at under the moon, this one woman took the little wedge marks that had been made for counting barley, and she made them carry, instead, the private weather of a single soul. Her love and her fear and her praise and her pride in her own made things, and she set her own name to it so that it could not blow away. And it did not blow away. It is still here. She is the first author, not the first person to write, but the first we can name, the first who steps out from behind the anonymous clay and says I, the oldest signature in the world, a woman priest at the top of a moonlit tower pressing her name into the wet clay so that some stranger unimaginably far downstream in time might one day read it and know that she had lived. And you are that stranger. Tonight, her lamp is still burning, all these thousands of years on. One small steady coin of light left in a high window against the dark, and it says the thing the light always says, here is a voice, here is a person. You are not the first to lie awake under these stars and love them, and fear the dark, and want to leave some small warm mark behind. Rest easy. She kept us company across all that distance, We are keeping hers now. But no empire, not even the first and freshest, stands forever, and Sargon's did not. And because we do not dwell on endings harshly on these nights, we will let this one come the way endings truly come, slowly and mostly by simple tiredness, and hand the land on gently to what followed. Sargon grew old and was gathered to his rest, and his sons ruled after him, and then his grandson, a proud far-reaching king named Naram-Sin, who pushed the borders further still and grew so great in his own eyes that he had himself carved on the stone as a god, striding up a mountain with the stars above his head, and for a while the empire of Akkad shone at its very brightest. And then, the way a fire that has been fed too high and too fast will sink faster than a small one, it began to fail. The far cities pulled quietly loose again, remembering they had once been their own. The harvests some years came short, and down out of the eastern mountains, out of the high cold country beyond the plain, came a rough hill people the Sumerians called the Gutians, drifting in along the trade roads and the river valleys, taking a city here and a district there, not so much conquering the land in one great blow as simply seeping into it while its strong hand weakened, the way water seeps into a wall whose mortar has begun to crumble. And the old count of the sheep and the oil grew ragged, and the great roads grew unsafe, and the governors in the far cities stopped sending their taxes up to a capital that could no longer make them, and Akkad. The lost city, the first imperial city, sank slowly out of its greatness and into a long confusion, and then out of the confusion into silence, until it slipped away so completely that, as I told you, we cannot even find its grave. Let it go softly. It was the first of its kind, and it lasted only a handful of generations, no more than a great-grandfather can remember back. And then it lay down, but it had shown the world once and for all that the scattered cities could be made one, and the world did not forget the lesson even when it forgot the city. And out of that quiet, out of the dim, tired years when the hill men held the plain and the old count fell silent, there rose again, one last golden time, the oldest and most beautiful of all the cities, the one whose moonlit tower Enheduanna had served, Ur. It gathered itself back together as the Gutians faded, and it found a strong and steady king, a man named Ur-Nammu, and under him and his son the whole southern land came back into one hand once more. Not this time under the newer Akkadian north, but under Ur itself, under the old Sumerian south. So that this last flowering has the feel of a homecoming, of the most ancient part of the world sitting up one final time in its full strength and its full beauty before the long evening truly closed in. And it was beautiful. This was a rich and careful and well-governed age, an age that loved order and roundness and the doing of things properly, and you can feel that love in the single greatest thing Ur-Nammu left behind him. The thing that still stands out there on the plain today, patient and enormous under the desert sun, after 4,000 years, he rebuilt the great ziggurat of Ur. We climbed a ziggurat together earlier in this long night, so you know the shape of it, the great stepped mountain of mud brick rising in tiers toward the heaven where the god was thought to dwell. But the one Ur-Nammu raised at Ur was the grandest and the most enduring of them all, and a piece of it is standing yet, the lowest great tier of it, so that of all the towers of that world, it is the one you could still walk up to and lay your hand upon. Picture it new as he made it, in the freshness of that last golden age. A vast solid mountain of brick, built up in 3 shining tiers, its lowest stage alone the length of a temple and higher than a house, its outer face not the pale mud of the plain but baked brick set in black river pitch. That same dark bitumen the priestess sealed the baby's basket with, so that the whole huge flank of it gleamed a deep warm brown in the sun, and up the front of it climbed 3 great stairways, converging 100 steps and more, up and up to a broad platform, and up again to the little shining shrine at the very top where the moon god was thought to come down and rest. And it was not a fortress, and not a tomb, but a stairway, only that, a made mountain built for one purpose, to let the god come down to the people, and the people go up toward the god, meeting halfway between the flat brown earth and the wide night sky, and at night, when the real moon that the whole tower was built to honour rose full and white over the plain. Its cold light would have washed down all those 100 converging steps and glinted along the pitch-black gleaming tiers, and the whole enormous patient mass of it would have stood there in the moonlight, the single tallest thing for as far as the eye could reach across that dead flat land, holding its little lamp-lit shrine up close against the stars. It is a good thing to fall asleep beneath that tower, whether you climb it in your mind or only stand at its foot and look up. It was built by people who wanted, more than almost anything, to bring the far things near and the high things low, and to make a gentle meeting place between the earth and the sky, and it has gone on standing, and standing and standing, through everything, quietly holding that meeting place open, for 4,000 years. And Urnammu did one more thing, quieter than the tower and even more lasting. A thing you cannot see or climb, but that touches your life tonight more nearly than all that brick. He wrote down the laws. Somewhere in his reign, this careful king who loved order set his scribes to gather up the rules by which his people were to live with one another, the old customs of what was fair and what was owed, and to press them out plainly into the clay, so many clear and even sentences. If a man does this, then that shall be done, and this collection, the Code of Urnammu, is the oldest written law that has come down to us out of the whole human past, older by 3 centuries than the more famous black stone of Hammurabi that we will come to on another night. And what is gentle about it, what is worth carrying down into sleep, is not only that it is old, but how it begins, and what it reaches for. For its purpose, it says, right there near the top, was to see that the orphan did not fall into the hands of the rich, and the widow did not fall into the hands of the powerful, and the man of 1 sheep was not delivered up to the man of 100 sheep, that the weak, in other words, should have somewhere to stand against the strong, some plain written line they could point to and say, "Here, this is what is fair, and you may not cross it merely because you are stronger than I am." It is one of the first times in all the world that anyone had tried to write the fairness down, to take it out of the private breast of whatever lord happened to be judging that day, and set it in the open clay where anyone could learn it and lean on it and hold the powerful to it. And though the world it governed was rougher than ours in 100 ways, that one reaching toward, that wished to shelter the orphan and the widow and the man of 1 poor sheep behind a wall of written words, is one of the kindest and most hopeful things the whole ancient plain ever did, and it is the far root of a great deal that shelters you still. Let it rest gently in your mind, the old king and his scribes bent over the clay in the lamplight, trying, so long ago, to write down what was fair. And they wrote down everything else as well, for this last golden era was above all an age of counting, the most patient and thorough counting the world had yet seen, and there is a deep sleepiness in the sheer scale of it. Urnammu's son, a long-reigning and tireless king named Shulgi, who sat on the throne for close to half a century, built up around himself a vast and gentle machine of clerks and scribes and stewards, whose whole calm task was to keep track of the wealth of the realm down to the very last small thing, and they kept track of it in the little wedge marks on clay, and they baked or dried and stored those tablets by the tens and hundreds of thousands, so that from this one age alone more written records survive than from almost any other in the ancient world. They counted the sheep, every one, the flocks coming down off every hill in the kingdom counted and set down, and they counted the goats and the cattle and the fish brought up the river and the reeds cut in the marsh and the grain in every granary and the jars of oil, and the wool by weight, and the bricks a workman was expected to make in a day, and the very sandals issued to the messengers on the roads, so many pairs of sandals, of such a size, given out to such a man on such a day. There was a great central town in the heart of the kingdom whose whole reason for being was this counting, a clearing house where the animals owed to the crown from all the provinces were driven in and tallied and sent out again, and out of its ruins have come tablet upon tablet upon tablet, the endless soft arithmetic of a whole realm keeping careful, loving, patient track of its own quiet plenty. And I know that to a waking. Working mind, the counting of 100,000 sheep sounds like the dullest thing in the world, but that is exactly why it is the perfect thing to sleep to. Picture the clerk at his low table in the last of the lamplight, unhurried, the day's flocks all in, pressing the small even marks into the damp clay. So many ewes, so many lambs, so many at the fold of such a village. Adding the little column, setting the tablet on the shelf to dry among 1,000 of its fellows, and reaching, calm and tired and content, for the next. And let his patience be your patience, and let the long soft column of counted sheep go over you the way the sheep themselves go over the fold. One, and then another, and then another. Drifting past in a warm and dusty and endless and wholly untroubled line, into the dark, into sleep. And then, the way of all these worlds, this last golden grew still as well. It had shone so brightly and counted so carefully, but the careful counting could not hold off the slow turning of the age. The harvests faltered, the far provinces slipped loose of the patient machine one by one, and out on the wide grasslands to the west other peoples were already stirring and drifting in toward the rich old plain new folk with new tongues, of whom we will hear a great deal on our next night together. And the great count faltered and thinned, the tablets grew fewer, the last kings of for all their tallied sheep and all their sheltering laws and all their shining tower, found the realm growing thin and quiet in their hands, and one by one they passed, and their names, which the scribes had written down so faithfully in the clay, were folded away into the clay with everything else, and went down softly into the long memory of the plain. Let them go the way you would let go a name you are too tired to keep hold of, gently, without grasping, trusting that it is written down somewhere safe and will keep. Had risen, and had shone, and grew still, and its moonlit tower stood on in the emptying land above the sinking city, holding its little shrine up toward the stars as it had always done, whether anyone climbed it now or not. And the old golden south, the most ancient part of this whole ancient world, lay down at last into its rest, having given the world its first emperor, its first named singer, its first written laws, and its long patient love of counting the good ordinary wealth of a peaceful land. And the plain lay quiet under the moon, and the rivers went on easing toward the sea as they always had, patient and unhurried, exactly where we left them. And far off to the west, out on the dry grass under the same stars, new feet were already turning toward the water, and a small unimportant town on the river was waiting, still unknown, for the morning that would make it the greatest name of all. But that is the next of our nights, and it is a long, long way off, and there is not the slightest need to reach for it now. Rest here. The tower is standing, the sheep are counted, the lamp is lit, and it is her lamp, and it is still burning, and it will burn all night. And so the great city of grew still, and its last kings passed softly into memory, and the wide land of the two rivers lay for a while under a low grey quiet, the way a house lies quiet in the small hours between the last lamp put out and the first bird waking. The canals still carried their slow brown water, the barley still greened the fields in its season, and turned gold in its season, and was gathered in. But the old order that had counted every sheep and every sandal had loosened its careful grip, and along the edges of that settling world, out where the sown land gave way to the dry grazing and the open steppe, other people were moving now under the same stars. Quietly, the way you have surely felt sleep itself move toward you across a room, unhurried and sure, long before it ever reaches the bed. So let the counted kingdoms of the south sink a little further into their rest, and let us turn, without any haste at all, to watch these new people come. They were called the Amorites, which in the old tongue of the cities meant something like the people of the West, the Westerners, the folk who came in off the dry lands where the sun goes down. They were herders for the most part, keepers of sheep and goats, walking the wide margins of the settled world, with their flocks and their tents and their long memories. And to the tidy scribes of the old cities they seemed at first a rough and landless sort, people without proper towns, without proper gods housed in proper temples, drifting where the grazing led them. But there was nothing to fear in them. and there is nothing to fear in them tonight. They came not as a storm, but as a slow tide, a family here and a clan there, season after season, drifting in along the rivers, settling at the edges of the old towns, taking service, taking wives, taking land, until in time their chieftains sat in the seats of the little city kings, and their names, strange at first to the southern ear, were carved on the bricks as lords of this town and that. This is how the deepest changes in the world so often come. Not with a crash and a cry, but with a soft and patient seeping in, one quiet season laid down upon another, until one morning the land has a new people in it, and can hardly say when they arrived. So it was with the Amorites. They came in like the dusk, gently from the west, and they made themselves at home among the old canals, and out of all the little towns where they settled there was one, at first no greater than any of the others, that they would raise in time into the most famous city the ancient world would ever know. Come down now with me to that town, while it is still small, and see it as it was before it was anything at all, because there is a particular sweetness in seeing a great thing while it is still humble and unaware of what it will become. It stood on the Euphrates, on the flat brown plain in the middle of the land, where the river ran wide and slow and the reeds grew thick along the margins, and it was a modest place of mud-brick houses and narrow lanes, a market, a temple to its own god, a quay where the reed boats and the little river barges tied up to unload. Its name, in the old speech, was something close to Babelim, the gate of the god, and from that we have made the name you know, the name that has rung down 4,000 years and will ring for 4,000 more, Babylon. But there is no glory on it yet, none of the blue and gold that will come. Tonight it is only a working river town on a wide flat plain, its brown walls the same colour as the earth they were dug from, its rooftops low against a huge and dusty sky. A place where a traveller might stop for a night and buy a jar of beer and a round of bread and think nothing more of it, and go on in the morning and never guess that he had slept inside the future wonder of the world. Let it be small a little longer. Let it grow at its own slow pace, the way you are settling now, by no effort of your own, deeper and deeper into the dark. For it grew because it was patient, and because at last, after a long line of forgettable kings, it was given a patient king, and his name was Hammurabi. He came to the seat of Babylon as a young man, in a world still broken into many quarrelling towns, each with its own little king and its own stretch of river and its own old grudges, and had he been a hasty man, a greedy or a violent man, we would very likely not remember his name at all, for the land was full of hasty kings and they came and went like the flood. But Hammurabi was not hasty. For year upon year, decade upon decade, he did the small close work of a careful king, and did it well. He dug canals and kept them clean, so the water reached the far fields in the dry months. He mended the walls and filled the granaries against the lean years. He kept faith with his neighbours until the moment came when faith no longer served, and then, only then, patiently and without cruelty in the telling of it tonight, he gathered the quarrelling towns one by one under his single steady hand, until the whole wide land of the two rivers, north and south, the old cities and the new, lay together at last inside one kingdom, at peace under one law. And that is the thing to carry down into sleep about this man, not the wars, which we will let pass by in the dark unwatched, but that word, one law. For a scattered land of many towns, each judging its own disputes by its own old custom, had been a land where a wronged man could never quite know where he stood, and Hammurabi set himself to change that, to draw the whole broad country together, not only under one crown, but under one clear and even set of rules, the same in every town, for the great man and the small alike. And here is the thing he made, the thing worth rising in the night to go and stand before. So let us walk to it now across the quiet courtyard of the temple, under the stars, and look, it is a stone, a single great pillar of black stone, of hard dark diorite polished until it gleams faintly in the lamplight, taller than a tall man, rounded at the top and set upright where all may see it, out in the open, in plain view. This is the thing we call the stele of Hammurabi, and it is one of the oldest and one of the most touching objects that has ever come down to us out of the deep past. Near the top of it there is carved a picture. The king stands, and before him sits the god of justice upon his throne, holding out to the king the rod and the ring, the old signs of fair measure and true judgment, as if to say that the rules cut into this stone are not merely one man's whim, but something handed down, something the very heavens hold to be right. And below that picture, running all the way down the great black column, front and back, wrapped round and round it in close and beautiful lines, are the laws themselves, hundreds of them, pressed into the stone in the wedge-shaped writing. Small and even and endless. If a man does this, then this shall follow. If a builder builds a house and the house falls, if a farmer floods his neighbour's field through carelessness, if a man takes a wife, if a debt is owed, if an ox gores in the street. Case after quiet case, the ordinary snags and sorrows of ordinary life, each one met with its measured answer, so that any person who felt himself wronged might come and stand where you are standing now, and read, or have read to him, exactly what was fair, and know that the same rule bound the powerful as bound the poor. We must not make it more gentle than it was. Some of its judgments are hard, and belong wholly to their own harsh and distant age, and would seem cruel to us now. But lay that aside for tonight, and feel instead the deep and hopeful thing underneath. The reason this black stone still matters after all these thousands of years. Someone, long ago, in the very morning of the world, looked out at the tangle and unfairness of human life, at the strong who did as they pleased, and the weak who bore it, and thought, this need not be so. It could be written down. It could be made plain, and set up in the open where anyone might see it, the same for all, so that judgment need not hang on the mood of a judge or the size of a man's herd, but might rest instead on a fixed and public thing, carved in stone that would not change its mind in the morning. It is one of the very first times in all of history that a people tried, deliberately and in writing, to make the world orderly and just, to set a floor of fairness under the chaos of things. And whether they wholly succeeded hardly matters. What matters is that they tried, and that they left the trying here in plain black stone for us to find. There is something wonderfully restful in that. If you let it settle over you as you lie there, the old wish that the world should be fair, and that things should be set down clearly, and that the wronged should have somewhere to turn. It is a wish as old as this stone, and it has been quietly kept, all this while in the dark, waiting. Now let the great black stele stand there behind us in its temple courtyard, keeping its patient watch over the sleeping city. And let us go down into the ordinary streets of Babylon in its good years, and simply walk. For there is nothing in the world so soothing as an ordinary day in a peaceful town, seen slowly, with nothing at stake. It is morning on the river. The Euphrates runs wide and brown and unhurried past the quays, and the quays are waking, the long stone and brick landings where the boats come in, and the boats are many. Round reed coracles daubed with black pitch, spinning gently on the current with a single man aboard, broad flat barges heaped with grain, or with cedar logs floated down from the far northern hills, or with jars, always jars, roped and stacked and waiting to be swung ashore. There is a smell of river mud and wet rope and smoke, and under it, warm and yeasty, the smell of beer, for these were great brewers, the people of Babylon, and beer was not a luxury here but the daily bread made drinkable, thick and nourishing and mild, brewed from the same barley that filled the fields, sipped through reed straws from a shared jar in the cool of the doorways. Walk on. Here is the weaver at her loom in the shade of a courtyard wall, her fingers going over and under, in a rhythm as old and as steady as the river itself, the wool coming slowly into cloth beneath her hands. Here is the potter, his wheel humming, a soft grey shape rising and thinning between his wet palms as if by magic. Here are the merchants at their business under an awning, weighing out silver by the shekel on little balances, pressing their seals into wet clay to seal a bargain, arguing prices in low, unhurried voices over sacks of dates and wool and dried fish. Here a scribe sits cross-legged with a fresh tablet on his knee, taking down a contract for 2 farmers who cannot write, his reed stylus dancing its little wedge marks into the clay while they watch and nod. Children run in the lanes. A donkey stands half asleep in the heat with its load. Somewhere a hymn is being sung, slow and droning, from within a temple wall. It is a whole living city going peacefully about its day, buying and selling and brewing and weaving and writing things down, none of it grand, all of it good. And you may drift through it as gently as you like, invisible and unhurried, letting the warm, ordinary murmur of it carry you further and further from your own long day. Step in out of the sun, if you like, through one of the low doorways off the lane, into the cool of a Babylonian house. For these too were quiet and good, and there is comfort in seeing how little the shape of an evening at home has changed in 4,000 years. The rooms are small and thick-walled and dim, built around a little open courtyard where the light comes down, and the floors are swept, and along the walls stand the plain useful things of a life, the tall storage jars, the grinding stone worn smooth and hollow by years of barley, the loom leaning in its corner, the mats for sitting, the little clay hearth where the evening bread is baking against the coals and filling the whole house with its warm and simple smell. A family gathers here as the light goes. The day's work is set down. There is bread and beer in a shared jar and dates, and perhaps a little dried fish or a stew of lentils, and the low easy talk of people who have known each other all their lives, the small news of the lane, a marriage being arranged, a debt nearly paid, a field to be flooded when the water rises. In the corner a boy who has been sent to the tablet house, the school where the scribes are made, mutters over a fresh clay tablet by the last of the light, pressing his wedge marks in row by row, copying an old proverb his teacher set him. The same weary schoolboy grumbles pressed into clay that we can still read today, about rising early and the long hours and the master's ready cane. And then the tablet is set aside to dry, and the lamp is trimmed low, and the family lies down on the mats in the close warm dark, and the house grows quiet, and the city grows quiet around it, house by house, lane by lane. The whole of Babylon settling toward sleep under the wide plain sky, exactly. In every way that matters, as you are settling now. And when the day is done, and the river turns to beaten copper in the low sun, and then to grey, and then to dark, and the lamps come out one by one in the windows of the mud-brick houses, there are some in Babylon who do not go into sleep, but climb instead quietly to the flat rooftops and the high platforms of the temple, and turn their faces up to the sky. These are the astronomer scribes, the star watchers, the patient keepers of the night, and they are, in their soft and unshowy way, among the most quietly astonishing people in the whole of this long story. For night after night, year after year, generation handing the watch to generation like a lamp passed from hand to hand, they simply looked up and wrote down what they saw. They marked where the moon stood against the stars and how it moved and when it swelled and when it thinned. They followed the slow wandering of the bright planets along their road across the heavens and named that road and mapped it. They pressed all of it into clay, night after patient night, and kept the tablets, and compared this year's sky with the sky of 100 years before, until slowly, out of all that patient watching, a great order began to show itself, a vast clockwork turning overhead in reliable time, and they were the first people ever to read it. And here is the small marvel to carry with you across the very threshold of sleep, the thing from these old rooftops that has never once left us. They divided the great circle of the sky into 360 parts, 360 degrees, as we still divide every circle to this day, and they divided their counting into 60s, in a way so deep and so useful that it settled into the measure of time itself and has never come out again. For when you glance tonight at the hour and see that it holds 60 minutes, and that each of those minutes holds 60 seconds, you are keeping, without ever thinking of it, a count first made on the flat, warm rooftops of Babylon under these very stars 4,000 years ago, by quiet men who wanted only to understand the sky. The hour you are resting in tonight was shaped by them. The very minutes ticking softly past you as you sink towards sleep are counted out in 60s, because they counted so long ago by the slow brown river. There is a kind of company in that, a hand reaching all the way across the ages to touch the ordinary furniture of your own night, and it asks nothing of you at all except that you rest inside it. And they did more, these patient watchers, than count and divide. Out of all their long looking, they began to find the hidden regularities of the sky, the slow returning patterns that come round again and again, if only you watch long enough and write it all down, and so they learned to say beforehand when the moon would swell to full and when it would darken, and where the wandering planets would stand in a month or in a year, and they kept a calendar by the moon month after month, and slipped in an extra month now and then to hold the seasons true, so that the sowing and the reaping and the festivals should always fall in their proper time. To them the sky was not a scatter of chance lights, but a great slow order, dependable, readable, turning above the flat land in reliable measure, and they believed it spoke, that the movements overhead were bound up somehow with the doings below, and so they watched with a double care, half astronomers and half readers of signs, sending word to the king of what the heavens showed. We need not follow them into their omens tonight. It is enough to lie here and feel the deep restfulness of what they truly found, which was not magic at all but this, that the night sky is not wild, that it keeps its time, that the moon will come round again, and the planets hold their courses whether we watch or not, that above all the trouble and hurry of the world there turns a great calm clockwork of light, that has kept perfect time since, long before Babylon, and will keep it long after us. They were the first to read that steady order in the dark, and there is nothing in all their long night work that is not soothing to think of now, as the same reliable stars they counted wheel slowly over you where you lie. And so Babylon shone, for a while under its patient king and its watching stars, the gate of the god made great at last. One law over all the land and the whole broad country gathered in peace inside one steady hand. But no king lives forever, not even the wise ones, not even the ones the world will never forget, and Hammurabi in his time grew old, and laid down at last the long careful work of his reign, and passed softly into the memory of his people, as Sargon had before him, and U-Nammu, and all the good kings of the land. And here is the last gentle truth of this part of our night, the one to fold yourself in as you go down into the dark. What one patient hand gathers, weaker hands cannot always hold. The single steady grip that had bound the towns together loosened after him, finger by finger, rein by rein. The far cities began to slip away and go their own ways again. New peoples pressed in from the hills and the edges, as peoples always do, and the great one law faded back toward the old patchwork of local custom, and Babylon, which had been the head and heart of all the land, became once more only a city among cities, proud still and holy still, and never quite forgotten, but no longer great. Its glory did not end in fire tonight. We will not watch it burn. It simply dimmed, the way a lamp dims when no one comes to fill it, slowly without alarm, the brightness drawing down and down until it is only a small steady glow in a wide dark room, and then a memory of a glow. Babylon sank into a long dim quiet, and lay there through years we need not count, keeping its name and its old stones and its buried black stale of laws, sleeping through the centuries, waiting, as everything in this story waits, patient in the dark, to be lifted up and made to shine again in an age still far off. But that is far away, and there is no need to reach for it. For now the great city has laid its own long day down, exactly as you are laying yours down, the river breathing past its quays in the dark. The star watchers gone in from the roofs, the lamps put out one by one, and far to the north, up the long slow rivers, under the same wheeling and carefully counted stars, other hills wait, and other stone is being cut, but not yet, not tonight. Rest here a while in the warm dark of old Babylon, by the wide, slow water, and let the counted hours carry you softly, 60 minute by 60 minute, down and down into sleep. And so Babylon sank into its long dim quiet, and the great king was gone, and the black stone of his laws stood on in a stillness that gathered over the years like dust on a windowsill. And we do not need to sit and watch that quiet deepen, for it asks nothing of us, and there is nowhere we have to be. Let us do instead the gentlest thing, the thing this whole night is made of. Let us simply move. Let us leave the flat, warm south behind us for a while, the reed marshes and the mud-brick towns and the slow brown rivers spreading toward the sea, and turn, without any hurry at all, and go north. There are centuries to cross first, long, silent middle centuries in which not very much that we would want to keep awake for happened at all, dim years of small kings and quiet fields, and we will cross them the way you cross a wide dark room toward a light on the far side, not counting your steps, not troubling about the floor between, simply drifting over the years as easily as you drift now toward sleep. Let them pass over you. Let whole generations be born and grow old and lie down in the earth of the plain while you rest, and do not lift a hand to hold a single one of them, for they kept themselves perfectly well without you, and they will keep. And as we go north, the land itself begins, very slowly, to change under us, and it is a pleasant thing to feel it change. The country lifts. The wide flat glare of the southern plain, where the rivers wander loose and lazy across the mud and the horizon, is nothing but a long, low line of reeds, gives way by small degrees to firmer, higher ground, to rolling rises of grass and stone, to hills that stand up brown and folded in the distance, and far beyond them on the clearest days, to the first faint blue shoulders of real mountains, the highlands where the rivers are born. The air grows a little drier here, a little cleaner, with an edge of stone in it, and when the wind turns, a breath of far-off snow. The two great rivers, which lay so wide and slow and sleepy down in the south, run narrower and quicker here, cutting down into the higher land, and the Tigris especially, the eastern and the swifter of the two, comes down out of the hills bright and cold and businesslike between banks of pale rock. And it is here, up along the Tigris, on bluffs and terraces above the running water, that we come at last to the cities we have journeyed north to see, the highland cities of a hard and patient people, the cities of Assyria. The oldest of them, and the one that gave the whole land and the whole people their name, stands on a great rock spur above a bend of the Tigris, and it is called Ashur, after the god of the place, so that the god and the city and the country and the people all wear the one name together, folded into each other, the way a family name is folded down through the years. Below it the river runs, above it the sky stands wide, and on its rock the old city keeps its temples and its tombs, the first home of a people who would in time reach very far indeed. And downstream away, on the flat land where a smaller river comes in to join the great one, there is a second city, Kalhu, that a later age would call Nimrud, with its walls squared off upon the plain and its palace mound raised high, and further north still, where the Tigris runs beneath low hills across the water from where the great city of Mosul would one day stand, there is the greatest of them all, the city that becomes in the end the very heart and crown of this whole northern world, and its name is Nineveh. These are the cities of the war kings, and I will not pretend to you tonight that they were gentle. The kings of Assyria were conquerors, the hard iron fist of the ancient world, and they went out year upon year with their armies along the roads, and the lands all round them learned to fear the sound of their coming. But we did not climb all this way north to stand in the noise of their battles, and we are not going to. The battles are over. They have been over for thousands of years, and every trumpet of them has long since fallen silent, and the dust they raised settled back down into the fields 100 lifetimes ago. Let them lie. We have come for the other thing these hard kings left behind them, the quiet thing, the made thing, the works of their hands that outlasted every one of their wars, for wherever these war kings went with their armies, they came home again and built, and unlike the soft mud-brick south, they built in stone, and some of what they raised in stone is among the most wonderful and the most strangely tender things in all this long story. So let us leave the roads and the armies out there in the dark where they belong, and go in quietly through the great gate of a palace, and look only at what they made. And the first thing we meet, standing on either side of the gate itself, is so grand and so gentle and so patient that it makes a perfect guardian to fall asleep beneath, and I want you to picture it slowly. Set into the gateway of the palace, carved from single vast blocks of pale stone, hewn out of the living rock and hauled here on sledges by the labour of hundreds of men, there stand two enormous creatures, one on each side, facing out toward whoever comes, and they are unlike anything else in the world. Each has the great deep body of a bull, or of a lion, massive and still and utterly calm, with the muscled legs planted square upon the earth, and folded up along its flanks and rising over its back are two huge feathered wings, carved feather by patient feather in the stone, as though the beast might at any moment lift, and set upon those mighty shoulders, turned to watch the gate, is the face of a bearded man, a broad, calm human face, kind-eyed and grave and quiet, wearing the tall horned crown of a god. The Lamassu, these guardians are called, the winged bulls with the faces of men, and they stood at the thresholds of Assyria for the plain and simple reason that the kings wished their doorways guarded not by soldiers who tire and sleep and die, but by something greater and more lasting, a good spirit set at the gate to keep out all harm and to let in all who came in peace. And there is one small strange thing about them that I love, a little kindness the old sculptors worked into the stone, and it is this. If you stand square in front of a lamassu and look, you see it standing still, planted, at rest, two front legs firm upon the ground. But if you walk along beside it, past its great flank and glance up, you see that it is walking, striding forward beside you, its legs in motion, stepping out to keep you company. And the secret is that the sculptor gave it 5 legs, not 4, one extra hidden leg, so that from the front it should always be standing guard, and from the side it should always be striding on, forever at once at rest and in motion, forever keeping still, and forever walking you in. Think of that, as you lie there in the dark, a great calm-winged creature, with the face of a kind and bearded man, carved from a single stone, standing at the doorway of sleep, that is resting when you look at it and walking beside you when you move, and that has stood at its gate keeping watch, without once tiring, without once turning away, for very nearly 3,000 years. Let it stand at the door of your room tonight. Let it keep the gate. Nothing you do not welcome is getting past it, and there is nothing left in all the dark for it to do but watch over you while you go down into sleep. And when we have passed in beneath the wings of the guardian, we come into the long corridors of the palace itself, and here is the second of the great made things, and it lines the walls on either hand of us as far down the passage as the eye can follow. For the Assyrians took the lower part of every wall of every great room and hall and gallery, and they faced it with tall slabs of a smooth pale stone, a soft creamy alabaster that takes an edge like butter, and then, patiently over years with fine bronze tools, they carved that stone into pictures. Low reliefs we call them, because the figures stand only a little way up out of the flat, catching the light along their raised edges and gathering shadow in their hollows, and they run in long bands the whole length of the walls, so that to walk down one of these corridors is to walk along inside an enormous unrolling story carved in stone. There are the kings, tall and calm and stately, with their long curled beards worked strand by strand into the alabaster, their robes covered over every inch with carved rosettes and fringes and embroidered scenes so fine you could count the threads. There are the winged spirits, the good genies, standing among the figures with a small cone in one raised hand and a little bucket in the other, reaching out to touch the sacred tree on the shoulders of the king, sprinkling a blessing, a carved and everlasting gesture of care. There are processions of servants carrying dishes and fruit and game up to the feast. There are the wide gardens and the running canals shown in patient stone. the palm trees and the pines, the birds among the branches, the vine trained over the arbour. And yes, along some of these walls there run the hunts and the wars, the horses and the chariots, the far cities with their walls, for these were the deeds the kings were proudest of, and wished carved where all could see, but even where the subject is a hard one. The hand that cut it was so sure and so loving of its craft, so tender with every leaf and feather and rippling muscle and curl of a horse's mane. But what comes down to us across the years is not the noise of the thing, but the astonishing quiet skill of it, the marvel that human thumbs and a bit of bronze could coax a whole living, breathing, blowing world up out of a flat slab of soft pale stone and make it hold, motionless, forever. And there is one carved wall above all that people still stand before and fall silent, a wall where the great lions of the hunt are shown, and it is a sad thing in its subject, and I will not dwell on it. But the pity of it, the strange deep tenderness with which the old sculptor rendered every one of those great dying beasts, is itself the proof of what I am telling you, that inside these iron kings and their hard stone palaces there lived hands that felt and saw and loved the living shape of things, and worked in the pale stone with a gentleness that has long outlasted every hard thing they ever did. And there was one thing more these kings brought into their stone cities, and it is perhaps the tenderest of all, because in that dry high country it was the rarest and the most longed for thing there is, and that thing is green. They made gardens. The greatest of the northern kings loved gardens with a real passion, and would have his palace set about with parks and orchards and pleasure grounds, planted with every tree and vine and herb that his armies had ever seen in any far country they marched through, cedars brought down from the northern mountains, fruit trees and rare flowering things carried home as tribute and set gently into the earth of Nineveh, so that the king might walk in the cool of the evening through a whole gathered world of leaves. But a garden in that dry land is a thirsty thing, and the rivers ran low and far below in their beds, and so these kings did the patient, enormous, quiet work that I most want you to hold as you drift off, the work of bringing the water. Far up in the hills, many miles from the city, where the streams came down cold and clean off the high ground, they went and found the water at its source, and then they built, stone by fitted stone, across all those miles of broken country, long channels and canals to lead it home, cutting through rock where they had to, banking up earth where the land fell away, and in one place, where a valley lay across the path of the water, they raised up out of the ground a great bridge of stone, for the stream to run across, a mighty aqueduct of 1,000,000 dressed blocks, so that the mountain water might walk on stone over the empty air and come down at last, still cold, still clean, still singing, into the gardens of the king. Think of that water now as you lie there. Think of it setting out cold from a spring in the high hills under the stars and running all night down its long patient stone road, mile after dark mile, over the valleys on its bridge of stone, down through the sleeping country, to arrive before dawn among the cedars and the vines of Nineveh, and fill the channels of the garden and murmur there among the roots. And let the sound of it, that small cold ceaseless running of water in a dry land, be the sound you fall asleep to, the oldest and kindest sound there is. Water brought a long way through the dark by patient hands to a garden, and never once hurrying, and never once stopping, all night long. And now, out of all the wonderful things these war kings made, we come to the greatest keeping of all, the one that mattered most in the end, though they can hardly have known it, and it is the quietest thing of all, and it belongs to the last and mightiest of them, a king named Ashurbanipal, who ruled from Nineveh at the very height of Assyria's power. He was, like all his line, a conqueror, and his armies went out as theirs had gone, but he was something besides, something rare almost past believing in a king of that hard age, and he was proud of it above all his victories. He could read. He had been taught the wedge writing as a boy, the old cuneiform, the little reed-pressed marks we watched being born a whole night ago down in the southern reeds, and he had learned it so well that he could puzzle out even the most ancient and difficult tablets, the ones already 1,000 and more years old in his own day. written in tongues that by then were old and strange, and he loved it. Loved the writing and the learning and the old words with a collector's deep and hungry love. And so this king did a thing that no one, so far as we know, had ever quite done before, a thing so good and so far-seeing that we are still living inside its gift tonight. He set out deliberately, patiently, over the long years of his reign, to gather in one place a copy of everything. Everything. He sent his scribes and his agents out across the whole length and breadth of the old land, down into the ancient cities of the south, into Babylon and Uruk and Nippur, into the temples and the schools and the houses of the wise, with orders to seek out every tablet of worth they could find, and to buy it, or to borrow it and copy it true, or to bring it home, and to send it all north to Nineveh, to the king. And they did, for years, and the tablets came in their thousands upon thousands, and he had rooms set aside for them in the palace, and there they were sorted and shelved and ordered and kept. And oh, what was in them! Picture the shelves, in the still lamplit rooms, the tablets standing in their ranks and lying in their stacks, some no bigger than your palm, some as broad as a paving stone, each one covered over close with the neat wedge marks, and each one carrying its little piece of everything that whole world had ever come to know. There were the stories, the old tales and the songs and the poems of the gods, and the beginning of things. There were the star lists, the long careful records of the astronomer priests, tablet after tablet of the movements of the wandering lights and the risings of the constellations, the sky itself written down and filed away. There were the omens, the great collections of what this sign and that sign were held to foretell. There were the remedies, the physician's tablets, this herb for this trouble, this root steeped in this way for that ache, the gathered healing lore of 2,000 years. There were the spells and the prayers, the words to say against the dark and against the fever and against the fear in the night. There were word lists and grammars, the patient tool scribes used to keep the old dead languages alive and readable. There were letters and contracts and the counts of herds and fields. It was, in the truest sense, a library, the great library of Nineveh, the first true gathered library that we know of anywhere in the world, tens of thousands of tablets holding, between them, very nearly the whole mind of that ancient world. Everything it had thought and seen and feared and healed and sung, all gathered in out of the scattered dark and kept safe together in one king's quiet rooms. And among all those tens of thousands of tablets, shelved there in the lamplight with all the rest, there lay the thing that ties this whole night together, for there, copied out fair and complete on its tablets by some patient scribe at the king's command, was the oldest full telling we have of the very story we followed down in the south a whole night ago, the story of the king who feared to die and crossed the waters, and found the man who lived through the flood, there kept safe in Ashurbanipal's library. Lay Gilgamesh, the oldest story in the world, gathered in and shelved and guarded, waiting in the dark. And now we come to the ending of the northern cities, and I promised you we would not stand in the noise of any battle, and we will not stand in this one either. We will only stand a little apart, on a hill under the stars, and watch from far off, and see the strange soft mercy that is hidden inside it. For the empire of the war kings in the end grew hated by all the lands it had pressed upon, and those lands gathered themselves at last, and came against Nineveh, the great proud city. And after a long while the walls were breached, and the city was taken, and it was given to the fire. Let us not go down into the streets of that night. Let us stay up here on the quiet hill, far back, where all we can see is the glow, the great, slow red glow rising over the doomed city far below, its palaces burning, the cedar roofs and the painted beams and the tall doors all going up in one enormous, silent, distant flame under the stars, so that the whole valley of the Tigris is lit softly red, and then, over the long hours of the night, begins to fade and dim and settle, the way a fire settles, the way any fire settles when it has done, down and down toward embers and ash and, at the very last, toward dark. It is an ending. The greatest city of its age is passing, and the empire of the north is passing with it, and by the time the sun comes up there will be only smoke on the wind and blackened stone where the palaces of the war kings stood, and that would be a mournful thing to fall asleep on. If that were all. But it is not all. And here is the quiet miracle that I have been carrying all this way north to give you now at the very end, to hold. Down in the burning palaces, forgotten in all that ruin, unregarded, worth nothing at all to anyone that terrible night, were the rooms full of clay. The library. The tens of thousands of little tablets, the stories and the star lists and the remedies and the spells and the oldest Gilgamesh, all of it, shelved and stacked in its quiet rooms while the fire came roaring through. And clay, you must understand, does not burn. Clay, when the fire takes it, does the opposite of burning. The great heat that was eating the cedar and the cloth and the flesh of that dying city reached the rooms of tablets and poured over the soft, sun-dried clay, and did to it the one thing that could make it last forever. It baked it, it fired it. The way a potter's kiln fires a pot, harder than the potter ever could, drove out the last of the damp, and turned the soft grey clay stone hard and everlasting, tablet by tablet by tablet, all through that long red night, so that the very flame that was ending the empire was, in the same hour, in the same heat, saving the empire's whole remembered soul. And then the burning roofs came down over the baked tablets, and the walls came down over the roofs, and the ash and the earth and the slow drift of the centuries came down over all of it, and buried the great library of Nineveh, deep and dark and safe, under a low grassy mound, fired hard as brick, wrapped in the ruin of the world that made it. And there it lay while the city was forgotten. There it lay while the very name of Nineveh faded out of the world and passed into the sound of an old story. There it lay through century after century after century, 2,000 years and more of dark and silence, whole ages of the world rolling over the top of it and never guessing. The fired clay keeping its close-pressed wedge marks perfect and unchanged in the dark, the stories and the star lists, and the healing law, and the flood, and the king who feared to die, all of it waiting, patient past all imagining, hard as stone and safe as stone, for the far-off morning when men with brushes and gentle hands would dig down into that grassy mound and lift the tablets out, one by one, into the light, and hold them up, and slowly, slowly learn again to read them. The fire that ended the empire baked the empire's memory hard and gave it to us. And that is the thing to carry down into sleep tonight, the deep and kindly secret of the whole northern journey, that even in the burning and the ending, even on the very worst night the great city ever knew, the small patient soft-pressed clay was quietly being saved, being made to last, being handed safely on through the dark toward us. Nothing worth keeping was truly lost that night. It only went down into the ground to keep, the way you are going down now into sleep, to be lifted up again, whole, in the light of a morning still a long, long way off. Rest now. The guardian is at the gate, the water is running all night in the garden, the tablets are safe in the ground, and the story keeps. And so the great fire that took Nineveh burned itself slowly down, as all fires do in the end, from a roaring to a crackling to a low red bed of embers breathing softly in the dark, and the smoke that had stood up over the fallen city in a black column thinned and paled and drifted away at last down the wind, and the war kings of the north, who had built so mightily in stone and gathered the whole world's knowing into one great library, passed quietly out of the story and did not come again. We do not need to grieve them tonight. Their work was kept. Remember, the 10,000 tablets baked hard and safe by the very heat that ended them, waiting in the ash for us. Let us leave them there to their long rest, and turn away south, down the long slow tilt of the land, down the 2 rivers we have followed all this night, back toward the warm flat country where this whole story began. Because the old land has one more bright thing left in it, one last high golden noon before the evening comes, and it is the fairest of them all. For while the north was burning, an old city down on the Euphrates, a city we have already walked in once tonight, a city that had risen once before under a patient lawgiver and then sunk away into a long dim quiet of many 100 years, had been gathering itself in the dark, and now it woke, and rose, and lifted itself up one final time into a glory greater than anything it had ever known, or would ever know again. The city was Babylon, and the king who raised it up was a man whose name has come down all the long ages to us, a name you may even have heard spoken somewhere before, in some far-off room of your life: Nebuchadnezzar. He was a great builder, this king, perhaps the greatest builder that this land of builders ever knew, and he came to a Babylon that was already ancient, already worn soft and low by the centuries, its old bricks crumbling, its old walls slumped, its temples grown shabby with age, and he looked at it, and he did not see the tired old town that stood there, he saw the city it could become. And so for the whole long reign of him, 40 and more years of patient, unhurried, tireless work, he rebuilt it, brick by baked brick, exactly the way his people had always built, out of the mud of the river shaped in wooden moulds and dried and fired hard. Only now there was so much of it, and it was raised so high, and it was made so fine, that the world had never seen its like, and has arguably not seen its like since. He made Babylon into the greatest city on the whole round earth, the largest, the richest, the most dazzling, a city so vast that a person standing in the middle of it could not see to the far side of it, ringed round with walls so wide, they said so broad along their top, that chariots could be driven along them, 2 of them side by side, and pass each other with room to spare. And through the middle of it all ran the river, the broad, slow Euphrates, dividing the great city into halves and joined across by a bridge, its brown water sliding through the heart of the roofs and the temples and the teeming streets as patiently as it had slid through the empty reeds 10,000 years before, when there was no one here at all but the fisherman and the wildfowl and the whispering marsh. Now, come with me to the great north entrance of the city, because there is a thing there that I want you to see before you fall asleep, a thing so beautiful that even to picture it in the warm dark behind your eyes is a kind of rest. All along the outer wall the brick is the plain warm brown of the river, as it has been in every city we have visited tonight. But here, where the road comes up to the gate, the wall changes, and it changes into something that must have stopped the breath of every traveller who ever came to it out of the dust of the long road, for here the bricks are glazed. Someone has learned to take the humble mud brick and coat its face with a glassy skin of colour and fire it hard, so that it comes out of the kiln shining and jewel bright and everlasting, and here at the gate they have used, above every other colour, a deep and glowing blue, a blue like the very last of the sky just after the sun is gone, a blue like deep still water, a blue like the heart of a sapphire, course upon course of it, wall upon towering wall of it, rising up on either side of the road into 2 great blue towers, with the gateway standing open and dark between them. This is the Ishtar Gate, named for the bright goddess of the evening star, whose lamp we have watched come out over these marshes all through the night, and it glows there in the low light deep blue and gold. And it is, I think, the most beautiful thing this whole long civilization ever made with its hands. And it is not blue only. Look, as you come up under the great blue towers in the last of the day, at what walks upon them. All across that glowing blue field, ranked in neat and quiet rows, one above another, from the foot of the wall to high over your head, march rows of animals, moulded in the brick itself so that they stand up a little from the surface, and glazed not blue but a soft warm gold, a tawny yellow white, so that they seem to be lit from within against the deep blue behind them. There are bulls, row upon row of great calm golden bulls, walking, each one with its head lifted and one foreleg raised as though it had been caught in the middle of a slow and stately step. and would set the hoof down gently in a moment. And between the ranks of bulls there walk other creatures, stranger ones, the dragons of the god Marduk, the lord of the city. Long, slender, golden beasts with the scaled body of a serpent, and the front feet of a lion, and the hind feet of an eagle, and a fine forked tongue. And they too pace along, calm and unhurried and unfrightening, one slow step frozen forever in the fired clay. Hundreds of them, bulls and dragons together, walking quietly up the blue walls toward the heavens, and not one of them fierce, not one of them made to menace you. They are only walking, endlessly, patiently, the way the flocks come down the track at evening, the way the rivers go down to the sea, the way this whole long night has been walking, slowly toward its rest. Pass in beneath them now, in under the deep cool shadow of the great gate, with the golden bulls pacing over your head against the darkening blue, and come through into the city. And on the far side of the gate the road runs on, straight and broad and paved, into the heart of Babylon, and it too is a wonder, and it too is worth a slow and drifting look before you sleep. This is the processional way, the great ceremonial road of the city, laid with slabs of white and rose red stone, set so smoothly and fitted so true that a cart could roll along it without a jolt. And it is walled on either hand, all its length, with more of that glowing glazed brick, more of that impossible deep blue. And walking along these walls, at the height of a person's eye close beside you as you go, there pace the lions, all down the processional way, on the blue walls to your left and your right, their stride rows of lions moulded in the brick, and glazed in white and gold and tawny yellow, each one caught in a long, low, powerful stride, the muscles of its shoulders bunched, its jaws a little open, its tail curled up behind, walking with you into the city, a whole slow parade of golden lions on either side, sacred to the bright goddess of the gate. Once a year, in the great spring festival when the whole city came out of doors, the statue of the god himself was carried in procession down this very road, out through the blue gate and back again, with the whole of Babylon singing and thronging along its length. But you have come tonight in the quiet, in the last of the light. When the road is nearly empty, and the lions pace along the blue in the stillness, with no one to watch them but you, and there is no festival, and no crowd, and no need to be anywhere at all. So walk it slowly, the long, straight, glowing road into the middle of the greatest city in the world, the golden lions keeping you gentle company on either hand, and let it lead you inward, toward the two great things that stand at the very centre of Babylon, the two things this king built that the whole world would remember longest. For the road brings you, at its end, to the heart of the city, and there, rising up out of the flat brown plain of roofs, lifting itself higher than anything else in all that vast place, higher than the walls, higher than the palaces, stands the great tower. It is a ziggurat, one of those stepped mountains of brick that we have watched these people build all through this night, rising in tier upon tier toward heaven, the same holy shape they first stumbled into long ago at Little Eridu, when they would not let the old shrine simply vanish, but built the new one on its packed remains, higher and higher over the ages, lifted up on the kept memory of itself. But this one, this great tower at the centre of Babylon, is the mightiest of them all, the tallest and the grandest ziggurat the land between the rivers ever raised, a made mountain of baked brick climbing in 7 great shrinking terraces, stage upon stage, with a triple stairway running up its front, and a little shining shrine of glazed blue brick set at the very top, up in the clean air, close against the sky. The people of the city gave it a name that meant the foundation stone of heaven and earth, the house that is the joining place of the world below and the world above, and beside it stood the great temple of Marduk himself, the lord of Babylon, with its doors and its walls washed over, they said, with gold, so that the whole holy centre of the city burned and glimmered in the sun. And here is a soft and curious thing to carry down toward your sleep. This tower, this vast stepped mountain of brick at the heart of Babylon, was so enormous and so famous and stood so high above the plain that travellers coming to the city from far countries could see it long before they saw anything else. A great man made mountain rising out of nothing on the dead flat land, and a later people, in a later age, remembering it dimly, remembering a tower so tall that men had seemed to be building it up to reach the very heavens, would tell a story about it. A story that has been told ever since, of a great tower raised at Babylon that climbed and climbed toward the sky. The Tower of Babel, they would call it. And that is all it ever was, in the end, the seed of that old half-remembered tale. This real and enormous and quietly astonishing thing. A mountain of river mud shaped by patient hands, and raised course upon course over the long years to lift a small blue shrine up close against the stars. And there is one more wonder here, the softest and the strangest of all, the one that hangs on the very edge of legend, and I will give it to you gently, the way it deserves, as a thing half-dreamed rather than a thing you could walk up to and put your hand upon. For it was said, and it has been said ever since, down all the thousands of years, that somewhere in this city, near the palace of the king, there rose a garden into the air. A hanging garden, they called it, though it did not truly hang, rather it was said to climb, terrace above green terrace, a great stepped hill of gardens built up on mighty arches and pillars of brick, tier over leafy tier, each level a little smaller than the one below, and each one planted deep with soil and grown thick with green, with flowers and flowering shrubs and full-grown trees, real trees, growing high up in the air above the flat brown roofs of the city, their branches leaning out over the edges and trailing down, so that from below you would see cascading over the walls not brick and not stone, but living green, leaf and blossom and hanging vine, spilling down the sides of a mountain that human hands had made. And up through the heart of it, they said, the water was somehow lifted, drawn up all that way from the river far below by some patient engine of wheel and bucket and chain, water raised up into the sky and let run down again through all those hanging terraces, so that the whole green mountain was cool and dripping and alive in the middle of the hot, dry plain. A piece of some far northern hillside conjured up out of the flat-baked south. The old stories said the king built it for love, for a queen he had brought to Babylon from a green and mountainous country far away, who pined on the flat brown plain for the wooded hills of her home, and so to comfort her he raised her a hill of gardens in the air, that she might climb up into the green and the shade and the falling water and remember, for a little while, the country she had left. Whether it was ever truly there, that green mountain, whether any spade ever really turned that high-flung soil, no one now can say for certain, and it does not matter tonight. Let it hang there in the warm dark, real or dreamed, a garden lifted up into the sky above the greatest city in the world, cool water running down through leaves in the heat of the evening, and let the sound of that falling water be one more soft thing to drift asleep beside. But now the light is truly going, and the city below is settling into blue shadow, and the first lamps are coming out in the windows, one and then another. Small dishes of oil with their floating wicks, the same small amber lights that have burned in the doorways of this land since the very beginning of the night, and it is time, before we rest, to climb. For there were men in this city who did not go in when the light failed and the lamps were lit. There were men who went up the long triple stairway of the great tower, up past the shrinking terraces, up to the high flat rooftops of the ziggurat, where the air was clean and cool, and the whole vast city lay spread out and glimmering below, went the astronomer priests of Babylon, the star watchers, the patient keepers of the sky, and let us go up quietly with them now, up out of the streets and into the enormous night. For this, of everything they made, of all the glazed blue walls and the golden bulls and the towers and the hanging green, this is perhaps the truest and the most lasting wonder of Babylon, and it is the one it is loveliest to fall asleep inside of, because it is made all of stars. Stand with them, then, up on the high roof of the tower in the dark, with the sleeping city below and nothing at all above you but the sky. And what a sky! Down here in this flat dry land, with no hills to hem it in and no mist off the sea, and no forests to breathe their damp into the air. The night sky comes down clear and huge and close, a great black dome hung from edge to edge with stars. More stars than you have perhaps ever let yourself simply lie still and look at. Thick as sown grain, drifts and rivers and dust of them, from one flat horizon clean over the top of the world to the other. And these men, night after patient night, for hundreds of years, longer than any one life, longer than many long lives laid end to end, stood up here and watched them, and they did the thing that these people had always done best, the thing they had done since that first clerk in Uruk pressed his careful count of the barley into the wet clay. They kept the reckoning. They counted, they watched, and they wrote it down every night on their little tablets of river clay, in the same small wedge marks their people had used to tally sheep and jars of oil. Only now they were tallying the stars, where the moon stood tonight, and how full, which stars rose just before the sun, and which set just after, and above all, the wanderers. For among all those thousands of fixed stars, that hang always in the same patterns, and turn together across the sky, and never change their places one against another, night after night, and age after age. There are a very few bright ones that do not stay put, that wander, slowly, against the fixed background, threading their patient way through the still stars along a single narrow road of the sky, now moving forward, now pausing, now even slipping backward for a time, and then going on again. 5 of these wanderers the star watchers could see, 5 bright errant lights, and the sun and the moon made 7 wanderers in all, and the Babylonians watched them as no one ever had before, learned each one's habits and its moods and its long, slow circling rhythm, wrote down its place among the fixed stars night upon night for so many years that they could tell, at last, where each wanderer had been, and, more wonderful still, where it was going, where it would stand a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now. And they saw that all 7 of them, the sun and the moon and the 5 bright wanderers, kept always to that one same narrow road across the sky, a single band circling the whole heavens, and along that road they marked out and named a ring of star patterns, a great circle of them through which the wanderers forever moved. 12 of them set round the sky like the 12 months set round the year. The ram and the bull and the twins, the lion, the scales, the scorpion and the rest, the road of the wandering lights, the belt of pictures we still call the zodiac tonight, and still name, many of them with the very names those patient watchers gave them up on the dark roof of the tower thousands of years ago. And out of all that patient watching, all those thousands of nights of counting, there came the greatest wonder of all, the thing that had never in all the history of the world been done before, and it is a gentle marvel to fall asleep upon. They learned to see into the sky before it happened. They learnt that all these turnings and wanderings were not wild and were not free, that they came round and round in vast, slow rhythms, in cycles that repeated themselves over long counted spans of years, and that if you had watched faithfully enough, and written it all down carefully enough, for long enough, you could reach forward past tonight and past tomorrow and say, with a quiet certainty, what the sky would do. They learned, most wonderful of all, to foretell the eclipse. They came to know the long, slow rhythm by which the moon, every so often, on a night that could be counted toward from years away, passes into the shadow of the earth and dims and darkens and turns a deep and dusky red, and then, in its own time, brightens and comes clear again, and they learned to count the span between one such night and the next. A rhythm of some 18 years and a handful of days, so exact and so faithful that the watchers on the tower could tell the priests below, long in advance, on which coming night the moon would be swallowed and given back. Think of that gently as you lie there under whatever roof is yours tonight, that up on the roof of the great tower, in the deep quiet of the counted dark. Men had learned to know the mind of the sky, to say without fear, on this night, in this month, the moon will darken, and be not afraid, for it will return, exactly as it has always returned, exactly as we have written down that it must. All the terror had gone out of the darkening sky for them, and in its place there was only the long calm music of a rhythm patiently learned by heart. The heavens turning through their great slow figures as steadily and as faithfully as the rivers running down to the sea, as steadily as your own slow breath. Going out now, and coming in, and going out. And this quiet roof, under the counted stars, is the very top of the whole long day of this civilization, its high and luminous noon, though the noon of it is a thing of midnight and starlight rather than sun. Everything the night has been carrying toward, all the long climb up out of the reeds, has gathered itself here, in this one shining hour. The first small marks pressed into clay to keep account of the barley have become, over the thousands of years, a count of the very stars. The humble mud brick shaped by hand at the water's edge has been raised and glazed and lifted into towers of glowing blue and gates of walking gold and mountains of hanging green. The patient people who would not let the old shrine simply vanish have built in the end a city that the whole world would remember, and learned to read the mind of heaven itself. It cannot last. Of course, nothing lasts, not even the fairest things, and this bright city too will in its own soft time grow quiet, and a new people will come walking gently in from the east, and the long evening of the whole story will begin. But that is another hour, and it is far away yet, further than you need to reach tonight. And there is not the smallest need to go looking for it now, for now there is only this, the greatest of all the cities lying at peace below you in the warm dark, its blue gate glowing, and its golden lions pacing quietly along the walls, its hanging garden dripping cool in the night air, its great tower lifting its little blue shrine up close against the stars. And above it all, the enormous patient sky, wheeling through its slow and faithful figures, every star in its counted place, the whole of heaven ticking softly over like a great calm clock, made all of light. Rest here, at the high still noon of it, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to go, and let the counted stars keep their long slow watch above you, and let the two old rivers breathe on toward the sea in the dark, and drift down now gently into the deep of the night. And so the star watchers came down at last from the high tops of the ziggurat, as they always did toward morning, folding away their tables of the counted stars, and the great luminous noon of the whole civilization stood a moment longer at its height, the way the sun seems to hang and rest a moment at the very top of the sky before it begins, so slowly you cannot see it move, to lean back down toward the west, for that is the way of every noon, the small noon of your own long day that you are lying at the end of now, and the great noon of a whole people that had lasted, by this point in our night, for the better part of 3,000 years. Nothing had hurried it up to its height, and nothing would hurry it down. It would come down the way everything in this story has come down, softly and in its own good time, and without any alarm, and we are going to walk the last of it together very slowly, so that there is nothing in the ending that is not gentle, nothing at all that you need to brace against, only a long, kind, downward slope into the dark, like a path that goes down through cooling air to the water at the end of the day. It began with a king coming, but you must not picture the coming of this king the way the word might make you flinch, with fire and with fear, for it was almost the quietest conquest in all the long history of the world. Far to the east, out beyond the mountains that stand blue on the edge of the plain, a new people had grown strong and gathered themselves under a wise and patient lord, and his name was Cyrus, Cyrus of Persia, and he had bound together the greatest empire the earth had yet seen, spreading out and out across the highlands until at last it lapped, like a slow tide, against the edges of the old land between the rivers. And Babylon, the great city, the gate of the god, sat there in his path, the oldest and the holiest and the proudest city in all the world. You might think there would have been a terrible siege, a long ruin, the walls thrown down and the towers burned. But that is not what happened, or not tonight, in the way we are choosing to remember it. The story that came down to us tells that Cyrus came to Babylon, and that Babylon opened to him almost without a fight, the great gates drawn back, the people lining the long processional way, the very way we walked in an earlier hour beneath the blue and golden bulls, and that he came in among them not as a destroyer, but as one more king taking up the old and honoured rule of a place far older than himself. He did not pull the temples down, he did not silence the star watchers or empty the storerooms or forbid the old songs. He took the hand of the city's own great god, as the old kings had always done in the ancient ceremony, and let the priests go on with their counting and the scribes go on with their pressing of the clay, and he wrote, in the careful words of that time, that he had come in peace, and that the people were glad. Whether it was truly quite so gentle as all that, no one now can say for certain. But let it be gentle tonight, for it very nearly was, and it is a lovely thing to carry down into sleep. The picture of the oldest city in the world passing softly from one age into the next, without so much as a lamp knocked over. The river running on past the quays exactly as it had the evening before, the same stars wheeling over the same rooftops, only the name of the far-off king changed, and even that spoken kindly. And so the ancient land passed, without breaking, into the Persian world, and became one province among the many of that vast and orderly empire, and the truth is that in most of the ways that would matter to a person living an ordinary life there, very little changed at all. The farmer still went out to his fields in the cool of the morning and let the river water in along the same small channels his grandfather had dug. The brewer still brewed, and the weaver still wove, and the potter still turned his wheel. The great temple still stood, and the incense still went up, and the priests on the roofs still watched the wandering stars cross the counted road of the sky, and wrote down, night after patient night, exactly where each one stood. For that watching had by now been going on so long, and had grown so accurate and so sure, that it went on almost of its own weight, handed down from teacher to pupil the way it always had been, indifferent to whose face was stamped on the coins. The land grew a little quieter, perhaps, and a little less the centre of everything, for the heart of this new empire lay far away over the mountains in the Persian cities, and the tribute now flowed outward toward them, rather than gathering, as it once had, here. But it was a soft settling, not a fall, the way a house where the children have grown and gone grows quieter, but no less itself, and the rivers went on breathing out toward the sea, slow and brown and patient, carrying the same silt they had always carried down to lay upon the same fields, and the long day of the land leaned gently on toward its evening. And then, after the Persians had held the land for a good long while, 10 reigns and more of their kings, there came out of the far west, out of the small rocky country of Greece that we have visited on other nights, a young man on a horse, and his name has never been forgotten, for he was Alexander, whom the world would call the Great. He came like weather, this one, swift and bright and unaccountable, sweeping across the whole width of the known earth in a very few short years, and the great Persian Empire, for all its age and all its order, gave way before him, and the old land between the rivers passed once again, softly, into the keeping of a new and distant power, and this time the power spoke Greek. But here is the gentle thing, the thing that ties this young conqueror so tenderly into our story. He did not hate the ancient city. He loved it. When Alexander came at last to Babylon, they say he too was met not with locked gates, but with open ones, the people coming out along the roads with garlands and with music, and he rode in beneath the blue Ishtar gate as Cyrus had before him, and he looked on the towering ziggurat and the temples and the wide processional streets, and something in him bowed to their great age. He gave orders that the old shrines were to be honoured and rebuilt. He meant, they say, to make Babylon the very capital of his whole vast new world, the beating heart of an empire that reached from Greece to the edges of India, this oldest of all cities chosen to be the centre once again. He had all the world before him, and he was young, and he chose Babylon. And it was there, within Babylon's own walls, that Alexander lay down and did not get up again. He had come back to the city in the fullness of his power, with everything still ahead of him, and every road still open, and there in the great palace by the river a fever took him, quietly at first, the way these things so often begin, a heaviness, a warmth, a wish to lie still, and it deepened, day by slow day, through the heat of the Babylonian summer, and the greatest conqueror the world had yet known grew weaker and quieter in a bed in the city he had chosen to be the capital of everything, until at the last he could not speak, and could only lift a hand, they say, to the soldiers who filed past him one by one to look on his face. And then, still young, still with the whole unfinished world spread out around him like a map he had meant to fill, he too laid the striving down. He died within Babylon's walls, the young man who had never lost, laid low at last not by any army, but by the oldest and gentlest and most certain thing there is, the same soft summons that comes in the end for kings, and for star watchers, and for reed cutters, and for you and for me, the quiet voice that says, "It is enough now, you have come far enough, lie down." And the great plans for Babylon, the capital of the world, died softly with him, unfinished, folded away, and his captains fell to quarrelling over the pieces of his empire the way tired children quarrel over the last of a game. And the centre of things which had rested for that one bright moment on the oldest city slid away from it again, this time for good. For when the dust of all that quarrelling settled, one of Alexander's generals held the old land between the rivers, and he did not choose Babylon. He built himself instead a new city, a fresh Greek city, a little way off on the banks of the Tigris, and he called it by his own name, and he drew the life of the region toward it. The merchants and the officials and the young men looking for their fortunes, the way a new dug channel quietly draws the water out of an old one. And so, without any cruelty, without any single blow, old Babylon began, at last, to empty. Not all at once. A great city does not empty all at once, any more than a great fire goes cold all at once. There were people living in Babylon, and worshipping in its temples, and watching its stars, for a long, long time yet, generations upon generations of them. But the tide had turned. The young ones drifted off toward the new town where the work was and the future seemed to be, and the old temples grew a little harder to keep in repair, and the crowds on the processional way thinned, year by unhurried year, until the great streets that had once been packed shoulder to shoulder on the festival days had room in them now, and quiet in them, and the sound of a single cart could be heard going the whole length of them. And the great cities of the whole ancient land, one after another, all across the wide plain, began their long, long sleep. Not in terror, not in fire, tonight we will not watch any of them burn. Only in this slow, soft, downward drift, this gentle letting go, the people fewer and fewer, the lamps in the windows fewer and fewer, the old holy places tended by fewer and older hands, until there came at last, in this town and then in that one, some evening when the very last of them went out through the gate for the very last time, and did not come back, and the city was left alone at last with the wind and the stars and the river, to rest. And once the people were gone, the land itself very patiently began to take everything back, and there is nothing frightening in this either, nothing but a great slow tenderness. The earth gathering its own back into itself the way you gather a blanket up around a sleeping child. The rivers went first, and this is one of the strangest and gentlest of all the things that happened here. For the two great rivers of this whole story, the Tigris and the Euphrates that we have followed since the very first hour of the night, are not fixed and faithful things that stay forever in one bed. They wander. Across the flat and level plain, with no hills to hold them and no rock to cut a channel deep, they swing slowly from side to side over the centuries, silting up one course and breaking out into another, so that a river that ran for 1,000 years beneath the walls of a great city will, in its own slow time, shrug and shift, and go looking for a new way to the sea, and leave that city standing dry. And that is what befell the greatest of them. The Euphrates, which had run for so long past the quays of Babylon, carrying its ships and filling its canals and giving the whole city its life, wandered away. It moved over the long years off to the side, and left the old harbours dry and cracking in the sun, the stone stairs going down now to nothing but dust, the water that had been the soul of the place gone murmuring away across the plain to run past no one, and once the river had drawn back, everything that the river had fed began, very quietly, to fail. For this had never been a green land of its own accord. You must remember, it was a land made green by water carried, a garden coaxed out of the dust by the patient labour of 10,000 years of hands, and all that green rested on the canals. The countless branching channels, large and small, that led the river water out from the banks and across the fields. And a canal is a living thing. In its way it must be tended, or it dies. Every year the slow brown water lays down its load of silt along the bottom and the sides, and every year the mud must be dug out again and heaped up on the banks, the whole long patient labour done over from the beginning, or the channel fills and chokes and closes. And when the hands that had dug them for so long were gone, drawn away to the new towns, or simply gone at last into the earth, the canals were not dug out any more. And so, quietly, they silted up. The great channels narrowed, and grew shallow, and grew choked with reed, and the water spread and slowed and could not reach the far fields, and stood, and grew brackish, and the salt crept up into the soil the way it does in that hot land when the water no longer runs, and the fields that had fed the first cities in the world went pale, and then went grey, and then went back to the wind and the wild grass and the dust, until you could walk for a day across ground where 100 generations had reaped their barley and never know that anything had ever grown there but thorn. And then the buildings themselves began to go home. For nearly everything in this whole long story, you will remember, was built of one humble and lovely material, the mud of the river itself, dug up wet from the bank and pressed into the shape of a brick, and dried hard in the great heat of the sun, the little round houses of the first villages, the walls of the cities, the temples, the towering ziggurats that climbed toward the counted stars, all of it, in the end, was the plain earth of the plain, lifted up and given a shape and set to stand a while. An earth that has been lifted up will, if no one keeps mending it, in time lie down again. Once the roofs fell in and the rain came through, and no one climbed up in the spring to patch the walls with fresh mud as the people had always done, the sun-dried brick began, so slowly, to soften and to slump and to melt. Each winter's rain rounded the sharp corners a little more. Each summer's wind carried a little more of the surface away as dust. The tall walls sagged and settled and grew low and rounded, and the fine straight edges that the builders had been so proud of blurred and were lost, and the whole great works of the cities sank, year by year, back down toward the flat ground they had risen from. The mud brick melting back into the plain patiently, the way a snowman settles and rounds and sinks on a lawn over the slow days, after the snow has stopped, until you would hardly know that anything shaped by hands had ever stood there at all. And this is how the cities of the oldest land in the world came, in the end, to their rest. And it is one of the quietest and most beautiful endings I know, and I want you to hold it softly as you lie there in the dark, because it is not really an ending at all, but a kind of long lying down. The melted mud brick, gathering and settling over the centuries, layer upon fallen layer, a whole city sinking down onto the ruins of the older city beneath it, and that one onto an older still, built up slowly into low, broad, gentle hills, smooth grassy mounds rising a little way above the flat plain. Rounded and soft-shouldered and green in the spring and gold in the summer, with the wind going over them and the flocks of some later, quieter people grazing across their slopes. The tells, we call them, these mounds, from an old word of that country that means simply a hill. And there are hundreds upon hundreds of them scattered across that plain, and every single one of them is a city. Lying down. Under the grass where the sheep are cropping is the top of a temple. Under the shepherd's feet as he stands leaning on his staff in the evening light is the palace of a king whose name he has never heard, and the schoolroom where the boys pressed their wedge marks into the clay, and the storerooms with their great jars, and the deep foundations of a tower that once climbed toward the stars, and the shepherd does not know. For that is the last thing that happened, the softest and the most complete. The names were forgotten, the very names of the cities, Ur and Uruk and Nippur and Kish and Akkad and Nineveh and Babylon itself, the names that had been shouted in the streets and sung in the temples and pressed into 100,000 tablets, faded out of the memory of the living, until the people who pastured their flocks over the mounds had no idea that these were cities at all, and thought them only hills, natural hills, low places in the desert where the grass grew a little greener, and the great world that had made them lay forgotten and unnamed beneath the drifting sand, asleep, and no one to remember that it had ever been awake. And somewhere in all that long, slow settling, in some small room in some emptying town, the very last of it happened, the thing that closes the whole long age, and it happened without a sound. For all through these centuries, even as the cities emptied and the canals choked and the walls melted down, there had still been, here and there, a few, an ever-dwindling few, who kept the old craft alive, the craft that had begun our whole night, the pressing of the wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. Long after the streets had emptied, in the last of the temples, a handful of the old astronomer priests still climbed to what was left of the high places on the clear nights, and watched the wandering stars cross the sky, exactly as their fathers' fathers had for 2,000 years and more, and came down and pressed the count of them into the soft clay, the position of this planet on this night, the turning of the moon, the almanac of the patient heavens, because it was theirs to do, and because someone had always done it, and because the stars, at least, had not gone away. And then one night, one particular night that no one marked and no one remembered, in some year we cannot name, the last of those old scribes sat down by the last of those small lamps and took up a last tablet of soft clay and pressed into it, with the reed, the last of the wedge marks, the last cuneiform ever written in all the world, some quiet little record of the stars, most likely some final tally of the heavens, and he smoothed it, and set it aside to dry, and put out his lamp, and that was all. The oldest writing on the earth, the very first handwriting there had ever been, the marks that a lamplit scribe in Uruk had first pressed into the clay to count his sheep and his jars of oil at the very beginning of this whole long night, was written for the last time, and laid down, and after that no living hand made those marks again. And the wedge writing fell silent. It fell silent, and it stayed silent, not for a year, not for a lifetime, but for 2,000 years, the knowledge of how to read it passing out of the world as softly as breath fogs and clears from cold glass, until there was no one left anywhere beneath the sun who could look at those small pressed marks and hear in them the sound of a human voice, and they became. On all the buried tablets and the fallen stones, only marks, only the tracks of some bird across old mud, beautiful and patient and utterly, gently mute. And now, at the very end of the night, having followed this whole bright thread all the way from its first stirring in the reeds to this deep and final quiet, we come to the one thing that the whole long story has been carrying toward all along, the gift that was folded inside it from the very beginning, and it is the most comforting thing of all, and I have kept it for the last so that you might fall asleep holding it. Because you might think, mightn't you, lying there, that when the names were forgotten and the cities melted down and the writing fell silent, then surely all of it was lost. All that living and building and counting and loving. 3,000 years of it, gone down into the mounds and the sand and the dark, with no one left even to know that it had been. But it was not lost, it was kept. And it was kept by the very humblest thing in the whole of the story. The thing so plain and so common that we have hardly paused to honour it, though it has been in our hands since the first hour of tonight. The clay, the soft brown mud of the riverbank, the cheapest and the least of all the materials of that world, the stuff they made their houses of and their pots of, and, when they had a thought worth keeping, their tablets of. For clay, once it is baked hard, either in a kiln or in the great accidental fire of a burning city, or simply by the long, slow bake of 3,000 years in the hot, dry ground, becomes very nearly the most patient and enduring thing that human hands can make. It does not rot the way a scroll of paper rots, or crumble the way a page decays. It does not rust like iron or tarnish like bronze. It is already earth, and the earth cannot take it back. And so all across that wide plain, beneath the grassy mounds where the shepherds walked and the flocks grazed and no one remembered, lying in the dark exactly where they had been set down, were the tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them. Millions, the whole memory of the oldest world, pressed patiently into humble clay and baked hard and buried gently, waiting in the dark, the way everything in this story has waited, patient and unhurried and unafraid, to be lifted up again. And every single thing was there. The tablet with the flood upon it was there, the great old story of the rain that came and covered the world, and of the one man who built the boat and rowed it out and sent the birds to look for land. Safe in the dark, whole, waiting, Gilgamesh was there. The oldest story ever told, the king who feared to die and crossed the waters of death to find the one who had survived the flood and came home at last, worn and wiser, to be content with his own good walls. The whole of him, tablet by tablet, lay sleeping under the mounds. The laws were there, the tall black stone with Hammurabi's careful even justice carved down its sides so that any wronged person might read what was fair, keeping its patient sense of order safe in the ground. And the count of the stars was there, the long, long record of the patient watchers, the road of the wandering planets and the turning of the moon, and the very way to foretell the coming of the eclipse. Tens of thousands of nights of watching, all pressed into the clay and kept. All of it. The flood, and Gilgamesh, and the first laws, and the count of the stars, and the first words a human being ever wrote, and the schoolboy's practice line, and the letter home, and the loaf and beer accounts of a brewer 3,000 years gone. The whole vast, warm, ordinary sum of a world that had lived and worked and wondered by these two slow rivers for longer than any other world before or since. All of it lying quiet and safe and complete in the humble baked clay.
In the dark, under the grass, waiting, without any hurry at all, through 2,000 years of silence, to be found.
And it was found. Long, long afterward, in an age so far from this one that the ancient land had had time to forget even that it had forgotten, people came to those low grassy mounds with picks and with brushes, and with an unaccountable tender curiosity, and they began, very gently, to dig, and up out of the dark, up into the light of a sun that had not shone on them in 2,000 years, came the tablets, the small patient tablets with their rows of little wedge marks, mute as ever, still keeping their long silence. And then, slowly, over the lifetimes of patient people bent over lamplit tables not so very unlike the tables the scribes themselves had bent over, the marks were puzzled out, sign by sign, sound by sound, the way you would slowly learn again a language you had never heard spoken, until one day someone, tracing the wedges with a fingertip, understood, and the writing that had fallen silent for 2,000 years spoke again. And out of the clay, into the world once more, came the voice of the oldest morning. Out came the flood, and the boat, and the sent-out birds. Out came Gilgamesh, striving and grieving and coming home. Out came the laws, and the star counts, and the boys' rows of practice marks, and the whole long-forgotten first chapter of the human story lifted up out of the ground where it had lain so patiently for so long, and read again and loved again, so that we know it tonight. So that we have been able to walk through the whole of it together, you and I, through all these gentle hours, only because the humblest mud of a wandering river was faithful, and kept it, and waited in the dark to hand it back to us. That was the gift. That was what the whole night was carrying toward. The cradle of the world rocked the very first of everything, and then, when its long day was done, it lay down to sleep, and even in its sleeping it kept the treasure safe, and held it up at last, unbroken, into our hands. And so we have come to the very end of the long night, and to the end of the whole long life of the oldest land, and there is nothing left now to do but to rest. Let us set it all down, gently, the way we set the day down at the very beginning, out here at the edge of the wide flat country of the south, where the two great rivers still come easing down through the reeds toward the sea exactly as they did on that first evening, slow and brown and patient, breathing out and out toward the water, for the rivers at least have never stopped and never will. The cities are lying down under their soft green mounds, and the names are safe now. Remembered again, spoken again, no longer lost. The tablets are lifted out into the light, and the wedge writing has woken and spoken and gone on speaking. The count of the stars goes on in other hands, under the same sky, and the little lamp is still burning in the doorway of the small mud house at the edge of the marsh, the one we lit at the very beginning of the night. One steady bead of amber hung out against the dark, tended by someone you cannot see, saying still, without any words at all, "Here is the bank, here is the way in, there is no hurry, come in when you are ready." And all around it now, out across the whole dark reach of the marsh and the plain and the round and turning earth, are all the other little lamps, all of yours. Every soft light that any one of you lit tonight by leaving your mark below, a whole world of them glowing quietly in the dark, each one a person lying still and safe and letting go, keeping the old river's company across all the miles and all the years and all the thousands upon thousands of years. The cradle of the world has laid itself down at last to its long, long rest, and it is not sad. And it is not frightening, for it did its work, and its work is kept, and now it sleeps, and you may lay yourself down beside it now into the same soft dark and sleep too. There is nothing more to carry, there is nowhere you need to go. The rivers will go on breathing out toward the sea without you, patient and unhurried, exactly where you left them, and the lamp will keep its light. And the whole long story will keep, safe in the ground and safe in the telling, until you wish to walk in it again. Rest now. Let the two great rivers breathe you down, slow and brown and patient, in and out and softer into the dark. Sleep well. The land between the rivers is sleeping, and so, now, gently, may you.